Good evening, YouTube. Thanks all for being here this evening. I am live with an incredible guest, someone I've known for many years, someone who is very entertaining, has an incredible sense of humor, a very, yeah, his own brand of sarcasm, but also very highly professional, very astute political observer and traveler, Lucian Valsan. I'm going to struggle to say that name, but hopefully that was close enough. And for your knowledge, he's a very prominent journalist. He is someone who's got a YouTube channel called The Freedom Alternative. He's a libertarian conservative, and he's got a great vocabulary. He's got some of the funniest takes, but also, as I said, some incredibly insightful takes. And yeah, Lucian, very welcome. Thanks for joining me this evening.
Thank you for inviting me. Now, first of all, I usually take offense to being called a journalist because I don't want to be put in the same bucket with all of these suckers from the mainstream media. I mean, I'm not a journalist. I'm just someone who gathers news. So there's that. Thank you for inviting me, I guess.
No, thank you. It's the honor's mine for you to actually come on the channel. I mean, I first learned about you some years ago through a friend of mine in the States who needed some information from you with regards to. No, it was prior to that. No, you contacted me, it might be.
Mm.
But when I discovered you had a great deal of knowledge of Russian politics and Alexander Dugin, and you were actually warning people to be very careful of Alexander Dugin when everyone thought he was just incredible, and he was the second coming of philosophy and so on.
Mm.
And you really
Yeah,
changed my
that was
mind.
it. That was 8 years ago or nine, something like that. Forever ago. It was
Yeah.
2016 because that was the time when more people had learned. I mean, I was aware of his work even prior to that, from since like 2012, but for several years it was a marginal figure. But only the most autistic people who studied Russian politics knew who Dugin was and his work. But then suddenly a bunch of inconspicuous Westerners, whom we later found out were actually paid in rubles, started translating his books, started shilling his work, and that's when I decided to make that video. That, hold on a second, this is a little bit more complicated, that video is still, much to my surprise, still up on YouTube. It's been plagiarized several times. Not that I'm bothered, but it's quite it's still quite surprising to me that after so many years, still the most comprehensive take on Dugin is still mine, considering the fact that I didn't take that video too seriously. I just started reading. By the way, this you guys think that this guy is a conservative? Here's him about transgenders. Here's him about this. Here's him about that. And it was basically a video mostly aimed at conservatives rather than mainstream society, precisely because at that time Duginism was for the right what cultural Marxism was for the left, namely a very extremist, subversive movement, subversive brain worm, if you want, which led people to believe all sorts of falsehoods or deranged things, which just so happened by coincidence to serve Russia's geopolitical goals.
That's like, since we're on this topic, what are Putin's aims? Because obviously in Poland, Polish policy is that it's not a matter of if Russia comes west, it's when.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that has always been the Polish view.
Do you think there's some validity to that? What do you think are
some
Russia's
validity?
aims?
Yes, some validity. Yes. At this point, I don't think even Sergei Lavrov can tell you what Putin's aims are, because things have gone so wild in the last 3 years or so that all of the previous logic of Russian politics has been just thrown out of the window, and now it's make it up as we go along. So even if you ask Sergei Lavrov, if he is honest, he will tell you that he doesn't know. So I can't know what Putin's aims are, but I can tell you what the feeling around him is, which is, comrade, this is costing us way too much, and the purpose of the regime was for us to make some money rather than rebuild the Soviet Union. So there's a lot of tension within the Russian regime because of this. This is something that is not new. During, I hate to give this example, but during Germany's National Socialist experiment, like about half of the top-tier regime was there for the grift. Göring was there to sell stuff. He was there to make money. He wasn't there to to push ideology. But then eventually things went really wild, and we all know what happened. Russia is pretty much in a very similar situation right now. There's the larger faction of the regime that wants to just make money, and the smaller faction of the regime that is really committed ideologically or historically or whatever. And Putin seems to be in the latter camp lately. So yeah, what are Putin's aims at this point? Nobody knows. I don't think even he agrees with himself uh, from one month to
Yeah,
the other.
the violence tends to escalate beyond your control. The
Mm-hmm.
fact that he's now getting help from North Korea, is that a sign of weakness? A sign that he's out of resources and needs assistance?
I don't know if it necessarily is a sign of weakness. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I just don't think it's really that important. A lot of Western commentators made a big hula baloo about this, made a big case of, oh my goodness, there's the soldiers from DPRK in Russia. Um, I don't think it's really that important. The total number of available troops from DPRK are a minuscule fraction of the overall assault forces that Russia is using on the front. I don't think they're going to make any significant difference one way or the other. But on the other hand, Russia today is not National Socialist Germany. There are still constraints on the regime. Like, for instance, if Russia were fully a dictatorship in the sense of Germany in the 40s, they would have just called in for another general mobilization. But they didn't do that because, politically speaking, that's terrible, even in a terrible place like Russia. So as a result, well, if you're gonna have to patch some holes here and there, why not DPRK? And besides, from North Korea's point of view, they do have a mutually defensive treaty with the Soviet Union, and the present
Hmm.
day Russian Federation is the legal heir of the Soviet Union. So from their perspective, they're just upholding their end of the bargain um,
Hmm.
from a legal standpoint. That's why
It
you've
also
seen
gives their troops some live fire training.
yes, well, to consider, it really does depend on how you look at it. I mean, there are also reports that once the North Korean soldiers got access to more unfiltered internet in Russia, they've started being very busy downloading pornography rather than paying attention to the training. So, it's a little bit more complicated. I mean, I'm not saying that there can't be very effective DPRK troops integrated into the Russian military, but I am saying that it doesn't make such a huge difference as so many Western
Right.
commentators rush to say.
Just one question on Dugan. There's lots of theories and lots of discussion about his philosophy, but to me, he seems a very dangerous man. He seems
Mhm.
to be someone that plays cards close to his chest, and I've seen reports that he's something of a Satanist or the rebirth of Marxism with a slightly new hat. But what is his
Mhm.
philosophy, do you think, and what makes him dangerous?
Oh, well, the Satanist label is not exactly, I mean, to a secular audience, it sounds weird. I mean, oh, come on, this is 2024 and we're using labels like Satanist. Well, yes, but in the case of Dugin, I mean, there is a legal document by the Moscow Patriarchate, and that was before Kirill, that basically called him a Satanist with theological arguments. So it's not exactly a wild label to call Dugin a
Hmm.
Satanist. Be that as it may, the reason he was consistently dangerous was precisely because his book Osnova Geopoliticheskaya had started being used in training in the upper echelons of the military. So he has a way to transmit imperialist Russian geopolitical goals in a way that speaks to the so-called Russian spirit. And you have to remember that Russians may look ethno-racially very similar to Belarusians or Ukrainians or at least Northern Russians, but their thinking is entirely different from Middle Europe. It's just they think in entirely different parameters, and Dugin is able to tap into that and broadcast an imperialist worldview, and that's what made him dangerous initially. Then later on, he got a promotion in the state university at the sociology department, where again he would school mostly the top brass of the FSB and the GRU and all of these top
Hmm.
tier law enforcement institutions and espionage institutions. The fact that he would teach some kids about radical philosophy, that of course wasn't particularly dangerous. We have a few of those in the West as well. But the fact that he was teaching the top echelons of the force institutions, the Siloviki as they call it in Russia, that's when things started becoming dangerous, and that's when he caught my attention around 2012 or so.
I'm just curious. This Russian mindset, this particular, I don't know, imperialist mindset, this particular ethos or morality that is part and parcel of the Russian psyche. Is this a holdover from communism, or is this a holdover from something, some other event, some other formative experience in the Russian psyche, something
How
else in history?
how much time do you have? It's more like an addition process. It's some of it is due to the Bolshevik Soviet period. Some of it predates the Bolshevik period by quite a lot. Like, for instance, this feeling that Russia needs to defend itself by expanding. This is a mentality that predates the Soviet Union by quite a lot. And if you
Mm-hmm.
ask a Russian ideologue, they will tell you that it dates from the time when Poland ransacked Moscow, which was in the 1600s, right? And ever since then, they developed this mentality that they're always under attack. Someone is trying to take them down. But since the 1600s, every single Tsar, whether the Tsar was called Nikolai or Stalin, uh, capitalized on that kind of mentality and on the existence of that event to justify their own power grabbing agendas and their own so it's kind of a bit of both. Yes, the Soviet period plays uh, plays an important role, but it's not the only moment that
Right.
formed
Yeah.
what
No.
we know
Just
today as the Russian psyche.
yeah. I know that Tsar Nicholas's father was a bit of a crazy man, but on a different question, Russia has been this war against the Ukraine, the special military operation, was supposed to take about 5 minutes. It's taken years, and it's dragged them
It's the
into this long
1000th day tomorrow, I think, or something like that.
something like that. Yeah, it's been going on forever. It's supposed to take a few days. Obviously, it didn't go as planned, but also Russia had to commit forces that it otherwise would have been used to protect its border. And I'm just curious, is Russia at risk on its southeastern or southern border to China, because there's an area that they took from the Chinese about a century ago that the Chinese have wanted back.
Yeah,
Is
the
Russia at
Chinese
risk from the
are
Chinese?
calling. Yeah, the Chinese are calling that part of the century of humiliation that needs reparation. Yes, the question emphasizes an aspect that I keep on telling people, and it takes years for people to believe me, as always, because nobody is a prophet in his own village. The geopolitical entity called Russia, whether it's called the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, or the Russian Empire, or the Tsarat, or Muscovy, or whatever, and the geopolitical entity called China, whether it's called the Empire or the People's Republic, or
Mhm.
however it's going to be called after the CCP, these two geopolitical entities don't really mix, don't really get along for too long. And
Mhm.
even during communism, they were aligned for like 5 minutes. Most of the time, they were at odds with each other. That's why I don't believe when Xi Jinping says that, oh, it's the limitless friendship. Yeah. Um, so there's that. Anyway, is Russia at risk there? Yes, but not the way people think. I don't think China is going to be very keen on military invasion there because they don't have to.
I know
Uh,
they're just buying up the whole of southern
yes,
Russia. I mean,
yes,
they just that's what the same thing they're doing in Africa.
yes, yes. They're playing the same project because why not? It has the same features as Africa, namely a corrupt, incapable of governance, remote government in Moscow. So who the hell knows what happens in Vladivostok, where China knows better, for through simple geographical proximity, and they just keep on sending their people. I mean, China has one thing that Russia doesn't: people, a lot of people. So, for China to send 20 million colonists is nothing, right? Whereas for
Wow.
Russia,
And
20
it's
million people
profitable rather
means
than costing you money burning through
yes,
military arms.
yes. I mean that has been the thinking in China for centuries now. And again, this predates the CCP. The thinking being that we should build client states or protectorates or whatever rather than annexing them outright. This comes from the lesson that look how complicated it is to keep Uiguristan, or Xinjiang as they call it, to keep it as part of mainstream China. It's such a difficult task even today. So from that
Hmm.
lesson, the Chinese ideologues in the 18th century and 19th century learned that, okay, we're going to stop annexing. We're already big enough. Now we're going to build client states, you know,
Right.
places that are quasi-independent, but they actually report to us. I wouldn't be surprised to see in the future, maybe not now, maybe not while Putin is alive, but definitely after Putin. I wouldn't be surprised to see, independence movements. The Eastern Siberia Free People's Party or something like that. That suddenly wants independence, and it just so happens to be entirely funded by China, and the new independent government will probably be straight up
Which
led
is
by
what
a
Russia
Chinese
did
person. Yes,
in Ukraine.
yes, yes, something like that. Except the Chinese can do it better. Um, and at that point, the economic strength alone will make it much harder for Russia to oppose the economic strength difference, because you have to keep in mind, even the Russian central bank admits this, that the overall cost of the war is already unbearable. I mean, if you look at the what is called the interest rate of the Russian central bank is like what, 21, 22% at this point. Everyone else has somewhat tamed the inflationist crisis. In Russia, it just keeps on going up and it just won't stop. And of course, it won't stop because you still have the same demands with a lot less labor force. What you think is going to happen? So yeah, um, at some point, the economic difference, even though China has its own economic crisis, which is very deep and very complicated to solve, Russia is still worse. And that's why for China is now very advantageous to just play along, play the peacemaker, just sell some weapons here and there, maybe. But other
Right.
than that, then just wait. There is this stereotype, the patience of an old Chinese man. That stereotype is not exactly for nothing. It exists precisely because that's how China functions.
Right. You know, in the 80s, Reagan actually used an economic warfare to bankrupt the Soviet Union. They were chasing after all of these initiatives that the US was supposedly starting. They couldn't keep up technologically, corruption just crippled them, and eventually they bankrupted themselves. And now you've got China in a very precarious position with its real estate, with its banking, with its student loans, and so on. You've got Russia also in a very precarious position. Not to say that the US is necessarily, I'd say the US is a little better off and has a bit of time. Do you think that someone is dusting off Reagan's old playbook and going, let's destroy Russia and China and take them off the world stage because they are a threat? China, at least, is specifically building a military to threaten the US. They're looking to take Taiwan. So do you think someone is taking notes and going, hey, we can play Reagan's old game and bring China down and, bring them back to the table a little bit humbled?
I don't know, but the results are definitely pointing in that direction. Whether it was intentional or just the result of disparate sets of incentives, the outcome is what you describe. Yes, more or less, we're seeing the Reagan's playbook. Um, and again, whether it was intentional or not at this point doesn't even matter. In fact, it's probably for the better, both for the publics and for the West overall, not to even
Right.
discuss it, whether it's intentional or not. Because
Okay.
if we, during Reagan, this was an open project. Yes, we're going to bankrupt the Soviet Union via economic warfare. This was a very open and honest thing. You would just say it outright in a press conference. Today, who's going to say that? I mean, yeah, I guess Trump would say it in public, but
Me,
can
mine.
you, yeah, can you imagine Kamala Harris or Joe Biden or by Nancy Pelosi or explaining these things? No, because they're too, well, let's face it, kind of stupid to explain these
No,
things, or too
to be
old.
honest, I can see Kamala giving Xi Jinping a lap dance for $5. I can't see her being
Yeah,
so.
I don't know.
I have one more question about Russia, because then I'll switch gears to China, and then we can move across to Europe and the US. The Russian Orthodox Church, can I get your views on that? How controlled they are? Well, what level of influence does the state have? How trustworthy are they? And just your
Entirely.
thoughts around that. How?
Around 2002, that's why I said that before 2002, Dugin was legally considered a Satanist within the Russian Orthodox Church. Around
Mhm.
2002, with the rising power of the current patriarch, who is a current KGB operative. I mean, there is no such thing as former KGB at this level, and former cigarette dealer. Anyway, once he achieved power, the first thing he did was to purge all of the clergy that was following some sort of theology that was, at the very least, somewhat in communion with the Constantinople Patriarchate. And somewhat reasonable. Let's put it this way. I still had my disagreements with the Russian Orthodox Church even prior to 2002, but after 2002, things went pretty insane. So to answer your question, how controlled they are, very controlled. At this point, the Russian Orthodox Church is just another extension of the Siloviki, of the Moscow regime. The idea that they're a separate institution is laughable at this point. And strictly from a theological standpoint, praying for the martyrs of the motherland, that's straight up ISIS level shit. I mean, it just doesn't fit with the Orthodox theology at all. So, and the only explanation for that is that, the KGB is fully in control. Sorry, the FSB is fully in control of the institution, even down to very low levels. If you read BBC Ruskaya Sluzhba, the BBC Russian service, every once in a while you also see cases of teenagers criminally investigated. Some of them even go to jail after they spoke with a priest about the war. Now, how did that happen? Well,
Oh my
obviously,
God,
yeah.
that
So
is a
these things happen, and again, they don't surprise me as someone who's been watching Russia for 30 years, maybe even more. None of this surprises me. I mean, this is just Russia, nothing serious, just that place, as I always say when people bring up something
wow. That is
wild.
shocking.
No, it's not.
That is shocking.
It's really not. By Russia standards, it's not shocking at all. That's why I'm saying that Russia is a very different place. This is probably one thing that Dugin got right, although for the wrong reasons. He was trying to sell the idea that we're better. But fundamentally, when he said Russia is a separate civilization, now I'm gonna debate whether Russia is a civilization or not. But it's definitely a separate thing from the rest of Europe. It just really
Right.
is
Like switching gears to China. China must be aware of their internal problems,
of
corruption,
course.
crime, economic instability, and also the crumbling of the infrastructure. The public's aware of it. China must be aware that it's running on borrowed time.
Mhm.
So aren't they being pushed to make a decision to do something before they collapse? Because they are likely to collapse at this point. They should have collapsed by now. So shouldn't they then take a military step, perhaps to distract attention or to try to give themselves some glory? Or what do you think their options are? And why are they a threat right now?
Realistically, it pays off for China to just do nothing and just wait. Because again, you have to understand the Chinese mindset. The Chinese mindset is
Hmm.
very patient. They think with the power of the century. They rarely think with the power of the next election cycle, right? Or the next decade. They're more than fine to wait for 20 years to make their move. Again, they've been waiting to take back Hong Kong for almost a century, right? They're very patient as a geopolitical entity, again, not the people necessarily. And we also have to keep in mind that the current president, Xi Jinping, is actually raised in a very anti-Russian school of thought of the CCP. That's why it's always laughable when these Russian shills say, "Yeah, but Comrade Xi will help us." Yeah, no, that won't happen. That just won't happen. So no, from Xi Jinping's perspective, if he grows old too fast and has an access of Putinism himself, then he'll
Hmm.
probably try to rush in a decision. But if he follows the standard Chinese playbook, I expect China to do mostly nothing spectacular with regards to Russia. They'll continue to do the colonization part. I mean, Siberia is slowly being colonized by Chinese colonizers, Chinese contractors, Chinese companies, and soon enough, de facto Chinese government. But that is beyond the visibility of social media, beyond the visibility of the press. Because, well, if you want to learn these things, you have to know people who live there. Now, I happen to know people who
Hmm.
live there, and they just keep on keeping me informed. But if you don't know people who live there, and if you don't speak Russian, then the only other option is to spend a lot of money to go there with a translator and start asking questions. And the more questions you ask, the more likely you are to get arrested anyway.
Right.
So it's very difficult for journalists, the actual journalists. It's very difficult to investigate this part. So as a result, for China, that's actually a very good thing because nobody's going to investigate, so they can keep on moving. But if they were to
Right.
do a military move, as you suggested, then that would be immediately visible, and
Hmm.
immediately either the Japanese intelligence service or the Indian intelligence, someone there would leak stuff immediately, and then the attention would move on China, which is not advantageous for the CCP at this point, because, as you correctly pointed out, the CCP has its own problems with banking and real estate and collapsing infrastructure as well. I mean, this is not a Russian issue, just a Russian issue. China has the same problem.
Right.
There's notorious those videos with highways collapsing at random. Recently, it happened in Serbia. A Chinese-built railway station at Novi Sad collapsed on several people. I think 5 or 6 people died. Recently built, right?
Wow.
Railway station. So the way, if they build it that poorly in Serbia, where they try to gain favors within the middle of Europe, you can imagine that their own infrastructure built at home, where the media doesn't see it and doesn't evaluate it because there is no
Even
real
worse.
opposition, it's probably worse. And
Do you
again,
think there's risk?
if you look on YouTube, collapsing Chinese infrastructure compilation, just look like that, collapsing Chinese
Mhm.
infrastructure compilation, and you will find unlimited amounts of compilations of things randomly falling off in China just in the last several years. So it's a problem on their end as well. Sure, in Russia it looks more spectacular, but it's an issue in China as well.
Right. Do you think that there's risk of collapsing China and leaving a power vacuum that can be filled, also an economic vacuum, a manufacturing vacuum? Do you think that there's risk of them actually fading into obscurity because one, they fail economically, and also there's risk that they don't necessarily have the kind of, I mean, they might seem like that they could also be a paper tiger, somewhat like Russia is, besides the nuclear force, and then people could start moving manufacturing out of China, and then next thing you know, China is running out of money,
Mhm.
China goes broke, and China starts to fade back into obscurity. Do you think there's a possibility of that?
Every 80 years or so, plus minus 10 years, the geopolitical entity called China implodes. And China has a very long history, and you can check it out yourself. Every 80 years or so, it's implosion o'clock. Now, the CCP has been in power for 79 years. So
Right,
you can imagine how much of a tension it is in the CCP elite, because everything is already lined up for another implosion o'clock. Now, if
right,
that happens, long term, it won't be a problem. China has been through this before, and if it will be again through it, they know how to handle it. They have a procedure for when the country implodes, because they've had more than 4,000 years to develop a procedure. And if there's something that China always does right, is bureaucracy and procedure. So they'll be fine. I don't think the consequences of another implosion of China will be that serious.
how long would it
As
take them to recover?
usually a decade. That historically, every time it took about a decade, maybe this time even less than that.
Okay.
Now, to recover to previous status, maybe more, but to recover up to the point that it's no longer a danger, not so long. However, when you say about the manufacturing, well, actually, that has been going on for 6 years. I mean, just these days, I'm videotaping a series from Propaganda Basement, and I'm reading from China Daily, so the
Mhm.
official CCP propaganda newspaper, where they sound increasingly desperate as you progress through the newspapers, precisely because the decoupling project from the Trump administration uh, worked. And not only it worked, but it was kept by the Biden administration. If anything, the Biden administration made it worse for China. And now there's another Trump administration, which will not be China friendly for sure. And
Mhm.
I've also had the opportunity to see the decoupling process working in practice as well. There's plenty of former Chinese contractors who are now moving their stuff, their factories into Laos, into Vietnam, into Cambodia, into Thailand, and other places around. Now, of course, Laos is a place that is de jure owned by the CCP, but it's still funny to watch that the CCP built the railways, the infrastructure, which is now being used to move business away from China.
No.
These things happen, and they have been happening for 6 years already. Um, Maybe not at a fast enough pace to the liking of the people whose geopolitical outlook is China delenda est, but
Yeah.
still pretty fast. And this the kind of phenomenon that the regime can't exactly stop. They can try to slow it down, which they've been trying a lot lately, but they can't exactly stop. And that's why. Um,
Right.
I think they're prepared for that scenario as well. And of course, there is also the demographic inertia, which is going to hit China hard, much harder than it will hit the West.
Okay. Two related questions. How much of a military threat is China?
I don't know.
excluding nukes now.
Hmm.
And what is the smartest single move that the West or the US can make to basically bring China down to a point where it's in need of help and the US can actually gain complete dominance over it?
Mm. Well, I don't know how well equipped the PLA is. Any of the external sources point to not so much. But we do know because they've tried to do some amphibious exercises to see whether they can take Taiwan or not. And their own internal assessment says the answer is no. So no, that's why everything about Taiwan is more likely for, how should I put it, for the internal consumption. The CCP is a dictatorial party, but it still needs the consent of the governed, or at the very least, the apathy of the governed. And playing
Hmm.
the nationalist card, as we've seen everywhere in the world, tends to bring some legitimacy and some political success to a political party. And reintegrating Taiwan is one of the nationalist talking points that always animates the spirits in mainland China. So there's that. I have no idea how good their land forces are. I don't think anyone does. If we're judging by how many people Xi Jinping keeps on firing, I'm to assume that it's not particularly great. But I could be wrong on that. What's the smartest move that the West could do? I don't know. Keep the interest rates high. I'm serious. Um, Keep the interest rates high. Yes, that would harm some of the friends of the regime in the West, like the tech bros, for instance, whose business can't exactly um, function in a high interest rate environment. But I think that's a good thing. We've had too much financialization of our economies in the West, too much tech, not enough making stuff that matter. So the smartest move would be keep the interest rate high. But of course, that won't happen because neither the left nor the right is prepared to tell to its own electorate that, look, the party's over and you're going to start paying off those debts. An interest rate
Right.
on the dollar of 10% would do wonders both for the Western economy and to also harm the Chinese economy. But that won't happen.
I
I
mean,
don't think it will.
you get the feeling with the new Doge, and you get the feeling with Trump's new policies that they are going to take an active stance towards paying down that debt, and people are enthusiastic about it. It's what they want because they feel that
We'll see what happens.
the it's right, but yeah, it's
I'm not particularly optimistic about that, to be quite frank with you. But even if everything Dodge related works, that still won't necessarily harm China. To harm China, you have to have higher interest rates
right.
than now, or at the very least, maintain them where they are now. But President Trump wants to pressure the Fed to take the interest rates down, which,
Right.
yes, would fire up economic growth in the short run, but it would also fire up probably inflation and it would definitely help China. So, and
I've
with
got
the
a couple of
tariffs,
questions.
yeah, sure, tariffs could work, but you would have to convince Europe as well. It's a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, so again, to change to another topic related to what you said, you mentioned demographics and childbirth in China is
Uh,
going to be
uh,
an issue. Now,
yes.
this is of course also an issue in the West. Now, of course, people will go, well, you see, it's the Martians that are doing it because the Martians want to, whatever. It's the fluoride in the water. It's the chemicals that are turning the frogs gay. You've got all of
Mm.
these reasons why. That rich people don't want to have kids, and so on and so on and so
Actually,
on.
rich people have the highest fertility.
I was about so yeah, but you've got all of these reasons getting thrown at you, but also there's the simple fact that you've got white women who seem that the most important policy on the face of the earth is being allowed to kill their babies.
Hmm.
And then you've got everyone going, oh, to save the planet, we have to let people die. We've
Hmm.
got to kill off the elderly. We've got to make sure we kill our babies. We've got to make sure
Hmm.
we have no children. And then they go, oh my God, it's a mystery, but we're not having children. I don't understand this. It's completely beyond me. And then they say, oh well, the only way to fix it is to import the third world. Um,
Yes, but then the third world also has the same demographic inertia and the same demographic trajectory, just slightly 10 years or 20 years behind the West. I made a series, a three-part series called Demographics and Fertility, where I went
that's
through all of these arguments, and the pro-natalists are going to hate me for it, but that's not my problem. Most of the mainstream pro-natalist arguments are just straight up wrong or based on facts that are no longer the case. Yeah, sure, white women, man bad or whatever, but China doesn't have this problem. I mean, it's a crime to be a feminist in China. You go to jail for feminist activism.
That's
And
great. Can we do that here?
yeah, but even so, the fertility rate continues to go down, like really down. You have some provinces of China with the total fertility rate of 0.4 or
So what's the
0.5.
real reason for the low fertility rate?
Well, the thing
And
is that we
how do we
don't
fix it?
exactly know. Well, how do we fix it? We just have more children. That's not complicated. But uh, there is not one single reason, and this is where most pronatalists get it really wrong. There is not one single reason, and there might be, but again, it's politically incorrect both with the right and with the left to ask this. Maybe there is a biological reason. Maybe there is something in us as humans when we realize that maybe there were a bit too many of us, and we suddenly go a little bit crazy just to tone down the fertility curve a little bit, and then go up again when the numbers are more manageable. Because why? This happened in the past as well. It happened during the Roman Empire. It happened in the
Hmm.
1920s. Like the total fertility rate of France in 1921 was significantly lower than it is today, and then it went up from 1924 onwards. So this happened in the past as well, and every time it happened in the past, we as humans had the same crazy ideas that of course didn't work, like let's pay women to have children, let's ban this particular cultural idea or that particular cultural idea or whatever, and lo and behold, those didn't work because
So what did work?
nothing. What did work was wait for a century or two until um, eventually people started having more children again. That's the only thing that worked.
Right.
Um,
Well, what about religious imperatives? You look at Islam, which it's there's the jihad of childbirth, where you simply
mm,
outbreed your
mm.
target population, and also
Yeah,
if you look at
how's that working out? Ever since the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the total fertility rate of the Islamic Republic went from 3.3 to 1.1 or 1.2.
Mhm.
It's among the lowest in the world is Iran, then followed by Qatar. I mean, Qatar has many defects, but it's definitely not a feminist country, and it still has a much lower fertility rate than
Right.
Poland or Romania or France, right? So I'm not buying the religious
Okay.
imperative
What
argument
about
too
Muslim birth
much.
rates in the West? Like take the UK, which is on track to become the first Western caliphate.
Yes, but then again, I don't particularly care what happens to the UK. You'll have to forgive me for that. I don't think the UK is a really that relevant country anymore. That's one aspect. Second aspect, who's having those many kids? What particular subset of Muslims? Because it's not all Muslims. The Turkish Muslims have the same fertility rate in the UK as they have in Turkey.
Okay.
The Arab Muslims have the same fertility rate, roughly speaking, as they have in Saudi Arabia, which
The
is
Pakistani
1.7.
Muslims, I would assume then.
Yes, yes, it's a particular subset of tribe from Pakistan. Not even all Pakistani Muslims, just a particular subset of tribes, right? So yeah, they'll have many people. Well, not anymore actually, because even they are starting to trend around the national average. But yes, they do have a much more positive inertia. But they're not
Mhm.
particularly qualitative. Let's put it this way. I don't want to have your video taken
So,
down.
so these projections of say the UK is going to be majority Muslim by the year 2070, and these kinds of figures you see, you think those are
Panic
speculative? It's
porn.
based on a projection that actually is not going to pan out.
I don't think so. No, panic porn. I'm working actually these days at a video about panic porn. There is a thread, a subset of people on the right. Now they do exist on the left as well, but not my problem on what happens on the left. Um, who present these kinds of topics that are whose role is to waste people's time. Because if you're busy thinking of demographic anxiety, then you won't be suing the state, you won't be lobbying the parliament, you won't be doing anything that would actually make a positive change in your community, but rather
Hmm.
stay indoors, scared, anxious. Oh my goodness, we're going to be a Muslim majority country, which in the end becomes a somewhat self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, that's one aspect. Second aspect, every single demographic projection made in the last 50 years was wrong. What makes you think this one is correct? Like, for instance, in the 70s, immediately after the independence of Bangladesh, the smart people from Harvard were saying that Bangladesh by 2020 will be bigger than the United States population wise. Well, that didn't happen. The United
Right.
States grew, yeah, I mean, yeah, Bangladesh doubled its population, but then it stopped because at some point you have enough kids, and then the demographic inertia necessarily
Yeah.
will lead to a lower fertility. Now, Bangladesh has a lower fertility rate than most of Europe. So that didn't happen. Same thing, it was the panic about how Nigeria will become overpopulated. And then suddenly that didn't happen. The fertility rate in Nigeria dropped from 8 to 2 point something, and it keeps on going
Wow.
down. And the capital city
That's
of Nigeria actually has a lower fertility rate than Germany, and Germany has a very low fertility
so
rate
it
as
seems
well.
that these statistics numbers have more of a political agenda behind
Yes,
them, a messaging behind them,
yes.
which
There's
obviously
lies, there's damn lies in statistics. Yes.
is really it's actually that is a good thing to know. I mean, the perspective you've given really sort of calms one down, thinking that okay, you've got to really question the information that you're being given.
Oh, and let's not forget. I mean, again, I urge your followers to look my series because there I went into great autistic details about this. But let's not forget, how are these numbers calculated, right? When we say that the fertility rate is 1.7, okay, but how did you determine the total population? Like, for instance, in Germany, the total fertility rate just went up because they suddenly went into this thing of, okay, let's actually count how many people are in Germany. And as it turns out, there were actually fewer than the official estimates. And once the denominator, when you calculate the total fertility rate, gets lower, then suddenly the total fertility rate is higher. So all of these things, some of it is not, it doesn't even have to be a political agenda or a conspiracy. It just has to be, how do you put it, clerical error. Because National Institutes of Statistics, yeah, go to playlists there. If you since you opened it, mm-hmm. Demographics and fertility. There you go. It's the first. Yeah.
Mm.
It's 3 episodes, 3 hours in total, not particularly complicated. A huge list of links. I urge everyone to also read those. But basically, what I did there was do exactly that. How did you come up with that number? Like, for instance, in Belgium, a child born alive that dies within 3 days of birth is not counted as child mortality, whereas the exact same scenario is a child mortality and counts for fertility statistics in the United States, but not all of the United States, only some states. So once you account for these things, some of the differences between the countries become a little bit less relevant and become a little bit more questionable. So that's why I say lies, damn lies in statistics. It's a little
Statistics.
bit more complicated. A
All
little bit
right.
more complicated.
I'm showing Lucian's YouTube page right now, and I've dropped the link in the chat a couple of times. I will be adding those links as well, so you guys can find him. Some really excellent discussions, really excellent analysis, and some really good humor. Very dry sort of humor and sarcasm, something that I'm very fond of myself. Um, yeah. Um, to the UK, right now, the UK is showing strong signs of despotism, of tyrannical thought control
Again,
and speech
again,
control. Again,
again.
well, you've got Keir Stalin, who is. I don't think the government's gonna last. I don't think he's gonna last. I don't see. I see the government collapsing, or at least he will be kicked out and he'll be replaced, and they'll
Yeah.
stumble along. And
And so what? You see, the thing is that with very few exceptions, like Iran would be an exception, where indeed the government is not exactly representative of the people, like at all. Anyone who's known Persians know that I'm right when I say this. But with very few exceptions, Iran being one exception, most people or peoples have the leadership that they deserve. So while Keir Stalin may be a little bit of an extremist expression, he's not exactly too far off the norm. The British people love the nanny state. They do. And they've been loving the nanny state for decades, if not more than 100 years. They've gladly accepted to sell their empire for cheap aspirin, right? And there was no
Mhm.
protest about it, right? They've gladly accepted speech controls much earlier than today. I mean, these things of arresting people or having people being nagged. I mean, I have on my channel from 2015, right before Brexit, pupils aged 12, 13, 14 nagged by the by the police, or by the superintendent for having or for having liked Nigel Farage's page on Facebook or things like that, right? And filed as a non-crime hate
Hate
incident, as the
incident.
yeah, yeah. So these things have been going on for a long time, and there has been mostly zero protest about it. The Brexit vote was a ray of hope, but then it produced 2 or 3 consecutive conservative government, which were anything but conservative.
Right.
I'm still shocked that they actually managed to do some form of Brexit. I was still expecting for them to find a way to stay in the EU. So I'm actually quite
Right.
surprised that but then again, just because they delivered Brexit, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing, because now we're seeing that they wanted Brexit just so they can do socialism at a much faster speed than the European Union. So, in the end, was Brexit a good idea? Well, on a timeline of 100 years, yes. But on a short time, in the last 10 years since the vote, well, 8 years since the vote, I'm not particularly sure it was a good idea, because now the British state, is more socialistic than the Европейский Союз, than Brussels. So,
Do you think that there's the chance of a MAGA type movement in Britain, perhaps led by a
I don't
political
know.
figure like Tommy Robinson? Do you think there'd be a
No,
pushback and a return to?
not by Tommy Robinson, that's for sure, because Tommy Robinson doesn't have the. I mean, he has the charisma, he has the knowledge, but he doesn't seem to have the political stamina to lead such a movement, because his
Yeah,
background
true. I think people
is in
acknowledge that.
profession. Yeah, he's in professional protesting, but it requires more than protesting to lead a movement. The MAGA
Right.
movement has positive policy: abolish the DOA, create the Dodge, lower the taxes, whatever. It has some positive policy, whether you agree with it or not. But the protest movement as it stands now in Britain has only, yeah, let's deport Muslims. Okay, how are you going to do that? Well, we just have to deport them. Okay, how? What is the procedure? What is your
Yeah.
policy? How you're going to select it? All of these things. It's exactly the same problem that Geert Wilders had in Netherlands for more than a decade, and only when he started swallowing up the intellectuals of the dissidents in the Netherlands, that's when he became prime minister, when he started having positive policy, a lot
Right.
more than immigration man bad. Immigration man bad is not enough to have a political program. You need
You
more
know,
than that.
I get frustrated listening. I watch American, people would be surprised how much American news I consume and UK news. I watch and I stay very current on what's happening politically in these countries. And I find that the British are just, I'm going to be blunt, but it will simplify what I'm trying to say. I find that commentators are very cowardly in their
Yes,
speech. Now,
yes.
I understand there's risk. If they say anything, the police could knock on their door at 4 a.m., but I still find that they are very milquetoast. They are afraid to use straight language. And part of that obviously will be the risk of being imprisoned. But other than that, I find that they just refuse to call a spade a spade. And I think this is part of the problem. If you cannot describe the problem, you cannot discuss the problem.
And if you cannot discuss it, you can't even begin to solve it or attempt to solve it. Yes. Um, for instance, the best sarcastic or even honest commentary on British politics, you find it on Sky News Australia. I mean, we joke a lot about Australia being an open air prison, and it is. But nevertheless, their commentary, at least on British politics, is far more honest than the British commentary itself.
Yeah.
I don't think Australia is more free speech friendly than Britain, quite frankly, but I do think that the hairs of the wardens and inmates have developed a more honest way
Yeah.
of talking.
But
Let's put it this
people
way.
call Australia a nation of prisoners, because in theory it was, but really it's a nation of jailers.
Yeah, it was also the guardians and the wardens. They also have their hairs in the
Yeah.
same country. Yeah,
Do you find Douglas Murray
plus some random chaos brought in by Greek and Serbian immigration. So yeah.
right? Yeah, I mean, I'm amazed by how New Zealand and Australia, even the UK, just immediately under COVID, especially, just moved to become extremely totalitarian.
Not a surprise at all. I would have been surprised if they hadn't done the same. You have to remember, Australia did exactly the same in 2009 with the AH1N1 pandemic. There
Really,
was,
that's like
yes,
5 people died worldwide in that.
maybe 10, but yes. Australia had lockdowns then too. Sure, they were a little bit shorter, but they had lockdowns then as well. In Australia, this was very much expected. I mean, I would have been very much surprised and indeed shocked if Australia had gone the Sweden route. And of course, they didn't, because that's why it's Australia. Um,
Right.
with New Zealand, same thing. I mean, they had the straight up CCP apparatchik as prime minister. So, of course, they had the
Yes.
Chinese policy on it. So unreasonable that they made the Taliban look reasonable. I don't think people remember. There was a New Zealand journalist who was coming back home and couldn't come back home because there weren't enough places for the quarantine camps or whatever. So she sought asylum to the Taliban, and the Taliban gave her asylum, even though she was a single woman with child, which is absolutely haram in Taliban theology. But even the Taliban recognized the situation, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, of course, you can stay here until your government comes to its
Crazy, and
senses."
they'd
Of
score
course,
political points.
yeah, of
You
course, of
know,
course. I mean,
Jacinda Ardern, I mean,
yeah,
horse-faced Jacinda Ardern,
Jacinda
crazy.
Ardern was worse than the Taliban. It's
Wow. Do you
really that
find
simple.
Douglas Murray? I mean, I think he's the best thing to come out of the UK. I find he's. How do you find his voice? I mean, he seems very well spoken, very refreshing, very honest.
Yes, but Douglas Murray is not interested in being the leader of the opposition in a political sense. He doesn't want to run
Mm.
for office. Douglas Murray is very good at identifying broad trends, although he sometimes exaggerates. But at least he's more attentive to data in a way that most other commentators are not, which is what I like a lot about
Right.
him. But he's not willing to transform himself into a policy wonk, and he's rarely offering positive solutions or no, sorry, that was wrong for me. Positive policy, as in affirmative policy. Okay, we're
Mhm.
against these things. Great. How would you do it? Come up with some positive policy. I don't
Right.
have to agree with it, but just
Yeah,
show
he's
me
more
that
like a
you.
prophet than
Yeah,
a solution provider. I mean,
yeah.
he's the guy warning about the problems.
Mhm.
Um, Man, how much time do I have you for today? We didn't even discuss that. How much time do you have?
Well, I don't know. My camera can still stay on for another 8 hours, so something like that.
So I'm just to you were recently you traveled. I mean, you traveled quite extensively, so it's one of the things that I think you're well known for. You traveled across Eastern Europe, right? You went to all the stans. You had
Mhm.
some great experiences there.
Except
You've
Tajikistan, which I'll do next year.
right. Well, what are the lessons that you learned? I mean, for those, one of the first things you said to me when you contacted me was you spoke about these racist policies that
Mhm.
the word is overused. The word is used like the word, the NAZI word. It's
Mhm.
overused, and it's used to smear people. It's used to
Of course.
prevent conversation. What did you learn? What was effective? Just lessons for Western Europeans and Westerners that are watching, who don't
Right.
understand. I mean, just what lessons did you learn from that? Because I enjoyed watching some of the series. It was really interesting.
Yeah, the context for that was what I've seen just last month while in Colombia and Ecuador. You can see I'm wearing the Ecuador national jersey, so it's still very fresh in my memory. Yeah, Colombia was in a long civil war with the cartels, as everyone knows. People think that everything went over once Pablo Escobar was killed, but that's actually not true. Things have gotten worse since then.
Really?
Until yes, until de facto until 2014, de jure until 2016, when the peace agreement with the communist guerrillas went into force, the Fuerza Armada Revolucionarias de Colombiana, and the armed forces, revolutionary armed forces of Colombia, which were Marxist-Leninist guerrilla. So that's when the civil war actually ended. So within 10 years since the war ended, Colombia went through top three most dangerous places in the world and never ever dare even dream about going there, to a place where foreigners flock for business, investment, leisure, and everything you can imagine in between. And it's a remarkably safe place. Now, the way they achieved this was by saying the right things to Western progressives to get their money, but then implementing things the way they knew it would work. Let me give you an example. There is such thing in Colombia, and I've seen a lot of praise for it in the Police Propaganda Museum. There is a pro-police propaganda museum. It's huge in
All right.
Bogota. It's called the Ministry of National Unification and Anti-Racism. It sounds very progressive, right? Very enlightening. The role of that bureaucracy is to approve or disapprove policies, especially law enforcement policies, on whether they're racist or not, or they're conducive to the objective of national unification or not. Okay, that's so it sounds very progressive, very weird, right? But then you look at what they approve. So, for instance, they approved racial profiling when there is um, a risk for national security or public order, which it always was during the times of the fights with the cartels, obviously. They approved very much targeted law enforcement based on statistics on where it is more likely to see violence. So that's where we're going to deploy more police. And
Hmm.
there is an official stamp that says this policy has been vetted by the Ministry of Anti-Racism, therefore it's not anti-racism. Therefore it's not racist. And that means that if someone complains, a progressive in the country or some foreigner, the only way you can arbiter that is you have to sue the state in an administrative court in Colombia. But the administrative court, just like anywhere in the planet, they only evaluate the paperwork and says the paperwork says it's not racist. Therefore, your lawsuit is going to be thrown out. So that's one way of doing the procedural way, in such a way that they get money from the progressives, or they used to get money from the progressives in the West, especially in the US. But then they implemented things the way they knew they should be implemented. Now, of course, this is not controversial inside Colombia. So-called
Hmm.
racial minorities and the white majority and whatever, they all agree that, look, this had to be done, this has to be done. There are certain sub-tribes and subgroups in our country that are more likely to cause violence, and of course we're going to police those harder than those that don't, because we have limited resources. We're a poor country, so we might as well use the resources as effective as possible. We can't afford luxury beliefs like in Los Angeles or in New York or in London or whatever.
Hmm.
So that's something that I really appreciated. I think it's the only country, or definitely it's the only country that I've seen that implemented these kinds of racist policies while maintaining a progressive outlook.
I
Because
mean, it's like calling something the Clean Air Act, which allows maybe more pollution by
yes,
factories. It's
yes,
that kind of same
yes,
thing.
yes.
So,
Because there are other countries who do this, but they don't pretend to be progressive, like Uzbekistan, for instance. In Uzbekistan, if you're too Islamist in public, in the past they used to boil you alive. Nowadays they just arrest you. And but they don't pretend to be progressive. They're like, "Look, this is the approved, state-approved school of Islam that everyone can follow if they want. If anyone doesn't want to be a Muslim, that's fine. But if you want to be a Muslim in a different way than the state-approved orthodoxy, off to jail." Right? But in Uzbekistan, they don't pretend to be progressive. They just do the rigorous enforcement this way, right? Or in Kyrgyzstan, where there is religious liberty for everyone except Muslims. When it comes to Islam, again, there is a certain state-approved orthodoxy. Only that is permitted, and foreign groups have to be approved per group through a very long approval process. And since
mhm.
Kyrgyzstan has been an independent country, only one Muslim group was approved, an Albanian group, which is really, really tame, a dervish order that basically likes to sing Kumbaya while they read the Quran. Any other Muslim group, or foreign Muslim group, was just not approved in Kyrgyzstan. Whereas for any other religion, there is total religious liberty. I mean, as a Christian, you could go do missionary um, in Kyrgyzstan, and that's okay. So, but again, Kyrgyzstan doesn't pretend to be progressive. They just straight up say, look, Afghanistan is nearby. The East Turkestan terrorist movement was founded just in the neighboring country. We have a problem with Islamist radicalization. Therefore, we're going to treat Islam separately and worse. And whoever doesn't like it, tough shit. Right? So those countries don't pretend to be progressive. But Colombia also pretends to be progressive. They just hosted the climate change COP29 summit just last week. It ended. The propaganda was in full swing when I was in Colombia about green stuff. But by the same token, they started building more coal power plants, and they just don't give a shit. They'll take the
Right.
money from the Western Greens, but then they'll build coal power plants with them. And that's something that countries in the second or third world should probably do more,
You know,
because
here in the West, here in Poland, they shut down their coal power plants. They flooded some of them, so they cannot be reactivated again.
Mhm.
And of course, and they were going to switch to free energy from the sun and free energy from the wind. Because it's free from nature. And of course, electricity prices have gone up 50% in the last 3 years.
I'm shocked.
So it's a big surprise. I have no idea how that happened, but so racial profiling in terms of crime management works. Is that
Of
the
course,
lesson that the third world? Now, why does the third world, these uneducated third world
rubes.
people, know this, and somehow Westerners don't?
Well, the third world, this is what I've seen both in Ecuador and Colombia. When you're wrong on policy, the consequences for that are very much immediately available. Let me give you another example. In
Mhm.
Ecuador, they had a president named Rafael Correa, a very much green socialist, Western style green socialist, who purposefully undermined the gas production of the country, the petroleum production of the country, and tried to get the country entirely on hydro and wind and whatnot. Now, Ecuador is struggling through a consistent stream of scheduled blackouts because the economy grew, and now only 70% of the necessary electricity of the country is produced via hydro. Wind turned out to be useless. I'm sure everyone is shocked to learn that. And it cannot be compensated via petroleum because, well, the petroleum installations haven't been maintained and fixed in so many years. And now they have a similar problem like Venezuela. Now, fortunately for Ecuador, it's a capitalist country. So now they're fixing that, even though it costs a lot. But now they're fixing it, unlike Venezuela. So they'll be fine in a year or two. But until then, they have to now go through a year and something of scheduled blackouts because there is no other way to go through this particular crisis. And so everyone got to see the immediate result of green policies, right? So, we elected Rafael Correa for 2 terms, and he got us into green policies, and now suddenly we don't have electricity. Now we're just as in the same problem as those poor fuckers from Venezuela who come to seek refuge in Ecuador because Ecuador, as bad as it is, it's actually far better than Venezuela. So, as a result, the argument is much easier. Now, the far right, conventionally speaking, can come in and say, look, we've tried that way. This is the result. We have scheduled blackouts. So can we please stop trying that way? Whereas in the West, the price for wrong policy is paid in increments, and it takes a long time until the effects of wrong policy are visible, right? Now, in this case, with electricity that you gave the example with coal power plants, in Poland, the effect was visible immediately. But most other green policies and most other wrong policies, socialist policies, generally speaking, in Europe, the effects of them are still not visible, or they're visible on a marginal scale. So it's good enough for people to ignore them for a decade or even more. And then when they finally become apparent, the argument is much more difficult, because then you have to explain to people how this procedure from 15 years ago led to this price increase. It's a long argument, and most people don't have time for that because most people are not policy wonks or economists or weird people like us who pay attention to these things. Right. Whereas in the third world, you don't have to be a policy wonk. You can easily see that the lights went out because of that president. It happens pretty much immediately, right? Same thing with immigration in Ecuador. Now they're having the immigration debate. For them, it's not an issue of diversity, equity, the economy, or whatever. No. They say, look, we, Ecuador, were the most open to immigration country in the Americas, period. Right? Anyone could get in without a visa in Ecuador except DPRK, I think. And look, for most of the time, this was actually a good thing because we had tourists who brought in money and whatever. But then, the cartels collapsed in Colombia and they all moved here. And now suddenly we have cartel violence, right? Can we stop having that? Well, first of all, we have to shut down the border. So for them, the debate is not one of racism or xenophobia or whatever. They're like, can we please stop having people being shot in the streets? And this is, again, very literal. I mean, I was right next to an assassination attempt while in Guayaquil in Ecuador. So this is a very common occurrence. And now the state has to come and fix it. And, well, the fix is mostly via far-right policies, which is, state of emergency, the military on the streets, more serious border security, all of these things that would be unacceptable in a progressive society. But, in Ecuador, they don't think it in terms of progressive or right-wing or reactionary. They think it in terms of, look, we tried your way, it doesn't work, let's try another way. The most common phrase that I heard in Ecuador in particular was, no soy de derecha políticamente, pero I'm not a right-winger, but, and then followed by a ringing endorsement of a very standard right-wing policy. So even the left in Ecuador is more like, yeah, I guess we're going to have to rethink a lot of things. And, maybe our Western friends are out of touch, maybe. Because, again, you can't deny reality. Whereas in Europe, we can still afford to deny reality. At some point, we won't be able to. But for now, we can still afford that.
So we just type a quick message to Sean. In the UK, for instance, it's happened in the US as well. But in the UK, they've stopped the whole stop and frisk thing, which was the US name for it, which means that you don't do racial profiling. But of course, we all know
In
Well, we're
practice,
not
that's
allowed
what
to
it
admit it.
is.
Sorry?
In practice, it is racial profiling, whether you like it or not.
Yes, it is, but we also know it's effective. We know it
Hmm.
works. Um, and yet, of course, to do so would be racist. Now, do you think that on this question that some people have, is it a deliberate policy pushed by people who are trying to manage the decline of the country because they want it to collapse so they can build a new socialist utopia out of the ashes? Or B, or is it the combination of both? The fear of racism, the desire to appear to be unbiased and to loving thy neighbor to the point of where you are uncritical and simply have no concept of enforcing justice or enforcing any kind of standards, and you're so self-critical, so self-hating that you think that everyone else is superior because clearly these people have I'm talking about the political left here, has mental illness problems, they have moral decision-making problems, they have philosophical issues. So these are issues. Well, what do you think? Do you think it's partly managed decline as a deliberate policy, and partly because it's moral blindness by people who are fed with too much woke ideology? And thank you again, Sean Anderson. Thank you very much again.
It's a bit of both. It's a bit of both, but it's also something else. And I'm probably going to piss off some of your followers with the answer, but uh, what's it to do? What is to be done? You will notice that these issues exist nearly exclusively in Protestant nations, right? They
Hmm.
don't exist in Latin America, Catholic America. They don't exist in Catholic or Orthodox Europe. They don't exist in the Islamic world. They don't exist in the Confucian world. They don't exist in the Buddhist world. They only exist in Protestant world. So I would look more into that. You know, this version of leftism that is now very loud, although still a minority view, but very loud, is modeled around the Protestant morality. And that's why you see them very shocked when they find out that there are billions of people out there who don't share their morality because, well, for starters, we're not Protestants. I reserve my right not to be a Protestant, and I reserve my right to not take Protestant morality seriously to begin with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason it works so well works depends on how you define works, but the reason it works so well in the Anglosphere is because the Anglosphere is the most Protestant part of the world, whether they admit it or not. And when I say Protestant, I don't mean necessarily in a religious sense, but in a moral sense, right? Because you can have a nation that doesn't quite go to church too often, but they can still function on Protestant standards. To give
Mm-hmm.
you an example, the Czech Republic, right? Czechia. Czechia is statistically very much majority atheist, like 80%
Yes.
atheist, right? But then again, it still functions on Catholic morality for the most part. There's still wide opposition to abortion. There's still wide support for extended families, something which in Protestantism is haram, right? There's still wide support for Catholic standards. So while they don't go to church anymore and they don't particularly like Mr. Bergoglio, they still function on Catholic standards. Whereas the same thing in Sweden, right? In Sweden, it's 60% atheist and another 20% pagans and Muslims and whatever. But the country still functions primarily on Protestant standards. And you
Mm-hmm.
see this in all sorts of aspects in society, from anti racism to things like kicking your kid out of the house when he turns 18, right? Statistically, right, in Scandinavia, kids go out of stop living with their parents at age 18. Meanwhile, in Catholic Europe, it's age 32. In Orthodox Europe, is 29, right? In Latin America, same thing, 28, 29. In Buddhist world, 27, 28. Living with extended families as a clan is very much common, except in Protestantism. So, you know, when English educated people from the Anglosphere complain that, oh, there's too much atomization and whatnot. Yes, in the Anglosphere, the world is not like that. The rest of the world hasn't bought
Mm-hmm.
into all of these Protestant influenced ideas in a way that the Anglosphere did. So that's why you have less atomization in Germany, even less so in Italy, even less so in Eastern Europe, even less so in Latin America.
So more
So,
social cohesion because of
yes,
this idea, right?
right. That's why it was also so easy for Javier Milei to sell libertarianism to Argentinians, because he was like, look, you already tried all of the other versions. They don't work, obviously. We cannot deny reality anymore. And to all of these lefty questions that are usually pretty difficult in the Anglosphere about, oh, but what happens if this, what happens if that, he would always answer, well, you have your family for that, which rings true to a deeply Catholic Argentina, but does not ring true anymore to a deeply individualistic, atomized Britain or US or
That's a
Canada.
fair point. I've spoken, I mean, the US obviously has the idea of freedom of conscience, individual rights, but
That's okay. The problem
right,
that I have
they
is
get
not
the
with the
point.
principle itself. The
But if you
principle
max
itself,
it out,
yes,
then of course I become the arbiter of what is justice. I become the arbiter of what is right. In fact, I define myself. So now I am a woman.
yes, yes,
That's the logical point where you end up, because you
yes.
there's no central authority. There's no external authority that you limit yourself by.
Or
You
external
personally,
authorities, right? No
correct,
input from reality of any
correct.
kind.
I'd say
It's the problem that, and you can see this on Protestant right wing as well. You can see this, that, oh, there is this principle, and then the atomization of society is inherently anti-family. Yes, it is. You see people basically saying, look, these are the principles, we're going to follow them through. But when principles become dogma, then you turn into Germans who don't allow any um, input from reality, right? If we have this plan, then we're just going to follow the plan through, no matter what happens. The Brits used to have something called the muddling through way of doing things. Namely, we don't do so much planning as the Germans. We'll see what happens. The say, we'll cross that bridge if and when we get to it, used to be the ethos of British thinking. But that
mhm.
also faded away over the decades, at least in part due to the fact that this Protestant influenced left wing morality became more mainstream. And of course, the Anglican Church becoming a joke, but that's a separate story for another day.
I've spoken about that many times. I come out of the Anglican Church, and yeah, it's a disaster. I mean, they really are not fit for purpose, and I think they should just shut their doors at this point.
It's the same joke that I make sometimes about Svenska Kyrka, or the Church of Sweden. If Svenska Kyrka had been a company, it would be audited and the entire board of directors would be jailed, because it's neither Svenska nor a Kyrka, right? It's neither Swedish nor a church. Increasingly, this is true about the Anglican Church as well, but that's not my problem.
No, I don't disagree with you there at all. You mentioned Malay. That's actually a really interesting topic. That was one of the things I was going to bring up, of course, him and Trump, to get your views on that. But I mean, this your religious take here on the Protestant morality, that is really fascinating. For I have covered on this channel, at the risk of upsetting people, but I tackle contentious topics on the channel. I've done almost 20 hours of detailed analysis. I've bought Luther's works, and I've done
Mhm.
detailed analysis of Martin
I've
Luther.
seen that series. It's a really good one. Yeah,
Oh, really? Wow. Thanks,
of
man. It's
course.
an honor. I appreciate it. And Martin Luther he was, he was a nominalist. I mean, this is a non-objective philosophy. It is the root of woke. It
Mhm.
is the philosophy that underlies woke.
As I said,
And
it's a Protestant influenced morality that
yeah,
caught on exclusively in the Protestant world, and in the rest of the world, there's only certain traces of it. But every time they get imported, they get hit by a barrage of the social resistance, whether it's Buddhist
interesting.
influenced or Orthodox or Catholic or Confucian, right? Because when you start from the wrong premise, eventually you will end up to a wrong result. And
Right.
the woke morality, influenced by Protestant morality, kind of starts from the wrong premises most of the time. Not always, but most of the time.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Villainous. You've got some really good takes here. Your insights are very, very, very well said. I mean, Lucian, your ability to verbalize, to articulate these thoughts, I mean, in many ways, better than mine. I try to say these things, but the way that you've explained them, I think, is very powerful based on your experiences around the world. From an African point of view, me being an African, living in Africa, you look at the woke thing, you look at the transgender thing. I mean, that isn't flying in Africa. I
Of
mean,
course
clearly,
not. Of course
these things
not.
have penetrated everywhere, but they certainly don't fly there, right? Because
If I may interrupt, I have a friend who thinks of herself as deeply on the left. She's from Namibia. She lives in Namibia. She did social
mhm,
work in Namibia with combating spread of HIV among hookers, sex workers. And her deeply liberal center left position on transgenders is, quote, they should all be shot, unquote. No, that is the moderate center-left position in Namibia. Okay, so like our friend Zubi sometimes says when he says that, look, Westerners have no idea just how far right the vast majority of the world is, and particularly Africa and the Middle East. But the thing is that it's not us who are far right; it's the West who is far wrong.
No, fair enough.
Sorry.
Like you remember, what's the guy's um Walsh, Matt Walsh, with his "What is a Woman?" He goes to Africa and he speaks to these guys about men being women, and the African
I'm
men
not a
just
big fan
crack
of
up
Matt Walsh,
laughing.
but yes, that was a good one. That was a good one. Yes,
These people just crack up laughing, and yeah, of course,
of
as an
course,
African, you're just going to go, "That's ridiculous. That is stupid."
of
You'd
course.
have to be a highly educated Westerner to believe something so utterly absurd.
To quote another African, ideas so stupid only an intellectual would believe them. Thomas Sowell, right?
Assault, exactly.
Yeah.
Incredible. Yeah, yeah, no, fascinating. Really well said, and I think definitely something for me to explore and to look into. In terms of my Luther series, I've only done roughly just more than half of my Luther notes,
Mm.
so definitely something to add to the mix. Yeah.
Anyway, to answer your question, because your initial question was, is it managed decline or just willingness to appear not racist and neutral and whatnot? And I would say it's a combination of both, because
Mhm.
since this idea is rooted in Protestant morality, most people in Britain and the US, being of Protestant background, whether they practice or not is irrelevant, right? Because
Mhm.
Matt Walsh says he's a Catholic, but his instincts are fundamentally Protestant, right?
Yeah,
Someone
America
of a
is largely a Protestant nation. Yeah.
Yes, even the Catholics are Protestants. You know that joke from Ireland, right? Are you a Catholic or a Protestant? Well, I'm an atheist. A Protestant atheist or a Catholic atheist, right? The same thing in the US. Even the Catholics are mostly Protestant. In the way they look at the world, the way they have their moral instincts. That's what I'm saying. Anyway, so because most of the society is of Protestant background, they will acquiesce to these things because they want to feel like good people, and because salvation is individual. If you are a good person, then you do have a chance at salvation. And if that's how they think,
Mm.
being love thy neighbor and whatnot, being dare I say autistic about being egalitarian and non-biased
Mm.
and whatnot, they feel that that's how they get their salvation. Whether they articulate that thought to themselves or not, the instinct is there. And
Right.
breaking that instinct is going to be very difficult. It will eventually happen once reality sets in. It's already started happening. You see much more people starting to articulate far right points, even among the Democrats, because, hey, reality cannot be denied ad
Yeah.
infinitum. But it takes a long time because these people have to go against their basic moral instinct, right? Same thing
Right.
with convincing people to abolish the minimum wage, because they're like, yeah, but it sounds intuitively good. Yes, but it's not. Even if it sounds intuitively good to you, it's not. I mean, the
Hmm.
minimum wage, as I'm sure you know from the history of South Africa, is fundamentally a racist policy and fundamentally a policy aimed against the poorest members of society. But explaining that to people who want to feel like good people, it's difficult, and it takes a
Right.
long process for people to defeat their initial instinct and start
Yeah.
looking at things more broadly.
Yeah. I want to add here. I did an analysis of Calvin. I did 4 episodes on Calvin. Not hugely in depth, but I did 4 episodes, and I've covered Luther extensively, and I will be doing more. I'll do some more this week. But Luther and Calvin both had a very degraded view of the human condition. They felt that people were evil, inherently evil, born evil. That there was no way you could find any kind of salvation. That you were steeped in evil. Even your best thoughts, where you thought you were doing good, you were still doing evil. That
Too bad they
even
don't
you,
apply that.
yeah, but that's how they felt, right?
Yeah,
That's
I
how they
know, I
felt.
know.
And the thing is that is a very negative, very gnostic, very dark
Hmm.
view of the human condition. That you see yourself only as evil, you become self-hating,
Hmm.
and there was
And
no,
therefore woke.
yeah. Whereas, that is not. I don't think that, from my perspective, obviously, this is not going to be the way to um, Now, look, many people will disagree with that, but I'm going to invite you to look through my Luther episodes, look at what Luther said. Now, you'll find that Lutherans don't necessarily follow Luther or apply Luther's theology. However, there's still elements of it all over the place, and these seep in. There's still the fundamental foundation is still there. That logic is still behind it. The infrastructure, the design is still there.
Mhm.
So, yeah, so there's something very deeply negative about Luther hated himself.
Yes.
And so therefore and he designed a theology for himself to deal with his own mental issues. So there's something there that we need to
Roughly
address, need to look
speaking,
at.
yes.
Sorry.
Roughly speaking, yes.
Yeah. So that is something that we need to look at as well. But that's a very interesting point. um there was Malay. Let's move to Malay for a moment. I mean, he is fascinating. I think he captured people's imaginations. What are your thoughts on him now? I asked you about this about half a year ago. You said, well, when he you said let's give it some time and then you'll talk about it. Is he successful? Because it seems like it. And is he going to inspire the world? And what are your thoughts?
I still don't think enough time has passed. Well, basically, what I'm looking forward to is the midterms in Argentina, which are next year, to see whether his party, La Libertad Avanza, manages to expand its presence in the Congress. And if yes, then we can start saying that he is successful. Because one thing to be kept in mind is that fixing the clusterfuck that is the Argentinian economy requires some deeply unpopular decisions.
Mm-hmm.
For now, he manages something quite extraordinary, namely to make some of those unpopular decisions and maintain his approval rate. It probably helps a lot that before he was elected, he basically promised to the people, you elect me, and a year and a half things will be very bad. And then they will start improving. So, he didn't promise them the rainbows and prosperity the next day after the election. He promised them things will get significantly worse before they get better. And now he's delivering exactly on what he promised. So,
Mm-hmm.
from that perspective, he's successful. But we'll see whether he manages to expand his presence his party's presence in the Congress, because without that, he has to govern with the mainstream right, with the party of the former president Augusto Macri. Now, lately, he has managed to make peace with those people, so now he's able to pass some legislation through the Congress without the hullabaloo and the scandals that were crippling his administration in the first 6 or 7 months since he was inaugurated. But whether that works, it's still up for debate quite a lot, and we don't have enough data. For instance, the prognosis from the IMF is that the Argentinian economy will contract by about 4% this year, only to then bounce back to +5 or even higher during the year 2025. Now, if that turns out to be true, we can definitely say that on the economic front, he was successful, much more successful than his critics have given him credit for. But if he somehow loses the majority, the coalition in the Congress, then we can say politically he was not successful. So we'll see what happens. That's why I try to stay away from the heat of the moment. That's why I don't do lives as well. I try to stay away from commenting on the heat of the moment, because I think the purpose of a conservative is to think things through before opening his mouth. And I try to live by that ethos. So what I can say is that he's already inspiring him and what's the name, Nayib Bukele of El Salvador.
Yeah.
These two leaders, alongside Trump up to a point, but these two in particular, Nayib Bukele and Javier Milei, are on the lips of pretty much everyone in Latin America. I mean, the current president of Ecuador, Mr. Noboa, is basically, okay, fine, we're going to do it the Nayib Bukele way with the crimes. Let's start building a big gulag and put all of the cartels in there. The Nayib Bukele way. Okay, we're running out of money. Let's borrow a page from the Milei governance. But okay, Mr. Noboa, who is the president of Ecuador, was already elected on a far-right platform. But then in Colombia, the current president is from FARC, from the former Marxist-Leninist guerrillas, right? Milei called him a war criminal, and by the way, Milei was right. And that guy, who is again of a Marxist-Leninist background, when I was there at the late September, there was a huge scandal because on October the 1st came into force a piece of legislation written by him and his leftist party that cuts 30% of the state funding for state universities, with a timeline to get that cut down to 100% by 2027 or 2028. And the justification for it, of course, all of the student unions and the teacher unions and all of the leftists in universities went apeshit about it, of course. And they went, well, come on, I mean, you're from our party. Why are you doing this? And his reply was very much Javier Milei style. No hay plata. We don't have money anymore. We just can't afford to keep you. So we're going to have to cut it. And again, he would have never dared to do this if Javier Milei hadn't been elected and started proving that you can actually do this. And the whining from the leftists in the state apparatus can actually be steamrolled through without much political consequence.
There's the idea that everything has to have an economic metric. But if you look at Brexit wasn't just about an economic metric. It's
The line goes up mentality, yeah.
Say again, please. It's about
the line goes up mentality, or now I'm increasingly calling it normative materialism. I'm working on a new concept on that.
It's about sovereignty. It's about reclaiming your identity. And for instance, the Japanese, their economy's contracted and so on, but that's not an issue for them because it's what they do in their country is their business. They're not measuring it strictly on an economic metric, and they want to preserve their culture. And if that's the price, then that's the price, and they'll fix it later. So, maybe the West should also look at that because we've got this potentially hyper-capitalistic view, and we've got to think, hold on. For instance, there was that interview with Homan, the guy, the new Homeland czar, and they said it's going to cost 88 billion per 1 million, which I don't believe. I think they pulled that number out of their butts, but per 1 million people deported.
That's not expensive.
And he said, what's the price of national security? Right. Yeah. But that said, in the UK, it costs potentially millions of pounds to keep one refugee there over a given period. So let's say it costs you £1 million to deport the guy. Well, it's going to cost you. I mean, these are not real numbers, but it's going to cost you $5 million to keep him. So get rid of him.
Yeah.
Right. Get rid of him.
Normative materialism is also, at least in part, of Protestant origin. I mean, at the end of the day, we all try to emulate what we call the Protestant work ethic. Why? Because it works. It brings much faster, much more prosperity than other versions of work ethic. Now, the thing is that everyone else from outside of the Protestant world, they got to pick and choose. They got the work ethic, but without necessarily the line goes up mentality or normative materialism. People inside the Protestant world didn't get this choice. Maybe they'll get it now, but they didn't get this choice. They got the whole package, which, yes, brought a lot of prosperity, but at the same time brought this mentality of that the line has to always go up. Everything has to be analyzed through an economic lens, and that's it. That's why I call it normative materialism. I mean, if Lenin were alive today, he would actually love the West quite a lot, right? Because he would say, okay, I guess I was wrong in how you get there, but you guys actually achieved a lot of the Leninist goals, right? Because the foundations of Leninism is, again, normative materialism. They didn't call it that way. They call it scientific socialism or the materialist dialectic, but the idea was exactly the same. Everything is judged through an exclusively materialist economic lens. How much illiteracy grew, but why do we care about illiteracy? So that the workers can produce more value, right? Except in the West, we don't produce value for the party, we produce value for ourselves or for the shareholders, but the fundamentals are the same. That's why you have these, toxic work cultures that exist mostly in the Protestant world that simply don't exist everywhere else, right? And again, some of that has very positive externalities, and that's why so many areas of the world, like South Korea or Japan or Egypt or Morocco and most of Latin America, adopted it. But the rest of the world also had the opportunity to say, okay, only this far, not forever. We're going to have to balance this with family life, with sovereignty, with all sorts of other elements that are also important, but that are increasingly neglected in the Protestant world. Does that make sense?
No, it does. No, it does. Everything you said makes sense to me. It's just that I've got to think and process these things.
Yeah. So when it comes to normative materialism, we do have this problem in Europe, and I've tested it personally, as in I spoke with almost every MEP, and they all, even the far right ones, they all have a normative materialist view of things. They
Hmm.
first and foremost look at the economics. And as long as things stay that way, and they will stay that way for at least another decade, probably more,
Yeah.
we won't see much progress in this direction, because it's very difficult to tell people that, look, some things are actually worth the cost. And the reason it's difficult is because, generally speaking, in Europe and North America, we no longer teach people that there is no such thing as solutions, only trade-offs. You can make some things better by making others worse, or you can make some things slightly better by making other things a lot worse, right? It's trade-offs. There is no such thing as
Mhm.
a policy without a public policy without
That's just
negatives.
relativism. That's just
Mhm.
relativism. That's refusal to acknowledge the fact that there's right and wrong, and there's things you need
Yes.
to exclude.
Yeah.
And also, you look at the UK, for instance, and Europe. You can't solve immigration because, well, immigration. Look at the economic benefits. I mean, that's purely an economic metric.
Yes.
Look
Yeah.
at the
The line goes
destruction
up.
of yeah.
The line goes
Look
up.
at the destruction of your countryside. Look at the
And
destruction of your cities.
again,
Look at the
this is an
destruction of your
extension.
society.
Yeah, but this is an extension of the more fundamental Protestant view, which is the line goes up. Like, for instance, Americans, when they see even Americans who are good friends of mine, their first instinct is to judge my lifestyle, for instance. Yeah, but look how much time you're wasting when you could be making money out of it. And I'm like, yes, but I don't want to make more money. I have more important things to think about. And my life is not entirely about money. And for a split second, it becomes they didn't even think about it. Why? Because a Protestant society raises people to always think about their money, and the line has to go up. Right? How is my 401k? How is my this? How is my that? Whereas I don't
Hmm.
have these kinds of concerns, and as a result, yes, I'm not wealthy, but as a result, I'm also much more stable in my mental health than a lot of my peers who
It's
think
more
way
free. You
too.
can get up and go, and you
Yes,
can travel.
yes,
Hmm.
I take freedom as a more holistic view, not just economic freedom. I use it. I take freedom as in everything. The fact that I can afford to, after ending this stream, I can just oh, you know what? I'm gonna go to the neighboring country today now because I want to. There's nothing stopping me from doing exactly that after ending this stream. Now, I won't because I have another idea on how to spend my time, but the idea is that I could do that without any serious consequence. And that's something that I count as freedom, but many of our Protestant friends don't. They count as freedom having a big bank account, which is fine. It's their choice, but we have to understand that all of this is a trade off. When you put money on top of everything, normative materialism, line goes up, you definitely miss something else. You miss social cohesion, you miss um, public infrastructure, you miss a lot of other things. Like, for instance, I made a video a few months ago about loitering laws, which they don't exist anywhere outside of the Anglosphere and Turkmenistan, right? And these days, the justification for them is that, oh, but teenagers gather there and the line no longer goes up to that particular restaurant because they miss some customers. Well, yeah, that happens in the rest of Europe as well, but there is such thing as certain places have a social utility, even though they don't necessarily have an economic utility, or they do have an economic utility, just not a maximized one, right?
Hmm.
Um, and this concept has become entirely alien in the among the people for whom the line goes up is the most important thing. And this won't change. It will change, but gradually and not anytime soon.
That is really interesting. You mentioned in the beginnings, earlier on, you mentioned that a lot of the propaganda, a lot of the news that you hear about, oh no, Islam is going to have 5 billion babies per woman, and in 3 weeks, the UK is going to be covered in Muslims wall to wall. And you said, look, there's a reality to that, and these predictions are there to scare you, which
Yes.
is a really interesting point. That said, I am detecting France, Belgium, Holland, Germany. I speak to people, I know people, they are concerned, they are frightened, and they are angry. And the government will arrest you for saying the wrong thing, having the wrong opinion, for criticizing the wrong religion. Right? In the
Mhm.
UK, they will come down on you like a ton of bricks. Now, you've got there's something like 6% of the UK population is Muslim.
Okay.
Roughly half of that are men.
Mhm.
Those 3 million men, roughly, are responsible for 87% of the terrorist watch list in the UK. Now,
Doesn't
people are
surprise
aware of
me.
this. Now, you look at your rape statistics. These rapes are not being committed wholesale by the majority population of white Europeans, white Brits. Now, you obviously have these serious issues, these gangs in the UK that are going around diddling young girls. 5-year-old girls are being taken by their parents to the police, and they're saying, "Hey, look, my daughter was accosted. She was taken to a dark room, and 5 men had their wicked way with her." And then the police will turn around and tell the girl, "Were you soliciting? Did you lead them on? Did you want it? Was it something that you encouraged?"
Mm-hmm.
This is and this is shocking. This is egregious. The police are clearly either complicit or they are frightened, and they clearly are morally astray here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, do you see if this cannot be discussed because it cannot be discussed? Now, X, fortunately, you've got Elon Musk has given everyone X, and that's a social outlet. It's a valve, a release valve where people can at least have some degree of truth to discuss. They can debate ideas in the public. But do you see an explosion? Do you see civil war? Do you see people
No,
pushing back an event
no,
that actually causes any kind of reaction
no,
and change?
no.
Why not?
Because every single prediction of civil war in the last 100 years was wrong, and I have no rational reason to believe this one will turn out to be true. Um, there was once a more serious spark. I believe they're called the 2012 London riots. That was the chance. It didn't happen then, it won't happen this century. That's one aspect. Second aspect, just because the statistics peddled by the merchants of panic porn are wrong, that doesn't mean the regime is correct. Both can be wrong, and in this case, both are wrong. There is, however, a success model, and I can't believe I'm saying this. If you had told me 7 years ago that I would be saying this, I would say you're crazy. But the facts are the facts, therefore I have to say it. Sweden. If you remember, 10 years ago, it was a meme on the internet with a map, a global map, and that said the most studied foreign language in every country. And in most countries, it was either English or French or Portuguese. And in Sweden, it was Swedish. The most studied foreign language in Sweden was Swedish. Well,
Okay.
that program, we joked a lot about it and said, well,
Oh, now I get it. The most studied foreign language.
yes.
Sorry.
So no, we joked a lot about it. I mean, imagine how many
Oh.
immigrants you actually have that is happening. But the thing is that worked. The integration programs actually worked. And then after a while, with the collapse of the corridor of opinion, Sweden had the same problem that Britain has now. But in Sweden, they're a little bit further down the curve, the
Oh,
narrative
they have
curve.
daily explosions. They have grenades thrown into police
Yeah,
stations. They
yeah,
have gang
yeah.
fights constantly. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Trust me, I do. I speak their language. I keep a lot of it in touch. I worked with one of their political operatives. I know a lot more about Sweden than you can imagine. I know all sorts of details, anyway, at some point, the most dangerous place in Sweden was called Rosengård, which is a majority immigrant, mostly Muslim neighborhood in Malmö. And at some point, one of the Muslim scholars there came up with a report and said, look, the mainstream society is correct to point out that this place is a shithole. But here's a report with a lot of evidence on why that is happening. Why is this place a shithole? And 99% of the problem was tied to one particular Deobandi mosque funded by Qatar. And it took several years to convince the intelligence services and the police there to actually look into it, because it was racist to look into it. But eventually they looked into it. And eventually, in 2021, they raided the mosque, deported everyone there, everyone associated with crimes, demolished the mosque. And that was it. That was the end of crime in
Well,
Rosengård.
70% of the mosques in the UK are Deobandi.
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all. But what I'm saying is that there is a success model. You just raid the problem. It's not Muslims in general. It's a particular subsect, a particular number of people. You target those, you remove those, and guess what happened in Sweden? The Muslims started voting for the far right because the far right actually solved our problem, as
Really?
opposed to the left, which caters to the weirdest views in our communities, but
Well,
doesn't solve our problem. The far right does, right?
okay.
So I would say that particular model can be used somewhere else. There is also some good news in Germany. In 2019, I made a video about, in the report, about an Iranian mosque in Hamburg, right? And it took 5 years. In 2024, eventually, the BND found time to raid that mosque. And lo and behold, it had terrorist literature, weapons, and whatnot, and started deporting some of the clergy there. And guess what? The crime wave it didn't collapse, but it halved in Hamburg. Just like that.
That's
Just
significant.
like that. A
Now,
single
here in
building
Poland,
and
they
10
monitor.
deportations.
Now, here in Poland, they monitor. There's one mosque in Warsaw. I think there's just one. They don't allow home mosques. They don't allow basement mosques. They don't allow any of these things to grow. And if they do find them, they shut them down and they throw people
Yeah,
out. And it
same in
works.
Romania, yes.
Now,
Yeah.
in the UK, for instance, let's look at this Manchester airport incident where two or three Muslims decided to go wild and they beat up a number of policemen. They sent, I think, three or four of them to hospital. They attacked a policewoman, broke her nose. Now, if you send a tweet, for instance, a couple of days ago, a man was arrested for sending a tweet stating he doesn't like to see Palestinian flags in the UK. That was his crime. He got sent to jail. Now, of course, you can riot, you can burn Israeli flags, you can scream hatred at Jews, and the police will say, "Hey, look, try to not be so loud, okay? If you
Yeah,
don't mind,
tone it down a little bit. Yeah.
yeah, tone it down a little bit," and that's fine, which is completely double standards. I mean, you've got 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 tier in the UK. You've got this incredible unfairness. You've got people who are saying things on Twitter that are being jailed literally overnight. You've got people who've committed heinous crimes, people who've killed children with machetes, who are given a
Are
suspended
sentenced
sentence.
to less than, yes.
Yeah, who are literally given suspended sentences. You have, again, where you are jailed for tweets for 2 years, 3 years, right? So now you've got crimes like this Manchester airport incident and machete crimes where people have died. These people are, and also the pedos are sent to walk free, which is crazy. Don't you think this level of unfairness? Now, look, obviously, part of the strategy of doing this kind of thing, this kind of in your face amnesty for criminals, is obviously to demoralize the population. It's a
Yes.
deliberate strategy. There's
Yes.
that. But also, don't you think that at some point they're going to push these people too far and the majority is going to go, you know what? We've had enough.
I'm skeptical. Let me tell you why. When was the last time the Brits really chimped out? It's been centuries. As a people today, they're simply not built that way anymore. Not the majority, anyway. In Eastern Europe, let me give you the example from Romania. In 2016 or late 2015, early 2016, when it was the height of the migrant crisis from the Middle East and North Africa, right? There was an incident in a relatively remote place. The video is still on my channel. It was featured by Breitbart at the time. Some foreign NGO decided to build a shelter for migrants, for asylum seekers, in a certain town in Romania. About 20 men showed up at the local authority and said, look, you tear this apart today or tomorrow, we start burning you all alive. This is not a joke. This is not a drill. Very calmly. I mean, the video with them threatening is on my channel again. Right? We're going to burn you alive. And, we don't want to end up like Western Europe, period. And there is nothing that will be deemed as too far from our perspective that we have to do to stop that. And that evening, the center was shut down. Everyone deported. That was the problem. That was solved. Why? Well, because those guys weren't joking. And everyone knew that those guys weren't joking. They would have burned them alive. It wasn't a joke. Why? Because it happened in prior times. Very recently, like in the 1997, 98, when Romania was preparing to join the European Court of Human Rights, it had a brief moment of tolerance for crimes committed by gypsies. The result was burning down entire gypsy villages. And then everyone figured it out that, okay, maybe we shouldn't do like West Europe, right? And then we went back to more proper law enforcement. So no, everyone knew that those guys weren't joking. Who can make such a credible threat in Britain and be taken seriously today, right?
Nobody.
Because again, what I'm saying is it happened in 2016. And then in 2017, a bunch of migrants
what is the solution? What is the positive policy for Europe to reclaim its culture?
There is no positive...
To put the foreigners who are not towing the line, to put them on a leash.
The premise of your question is wrong. There is no such thing as the positive policy for Europe, because Europe is not one single place. Europe is 54 countries.
Well, I know, but I'm thinking Western Europe generally.
Yes,
when you say Europe, we tend to, and let's say for Western culture, white Western culture,
even that.
What do they do?
No, even that, because there is one policy that can work for Italy, one policy that can work for Germany, one policy that can work for the Netherlands. Every single country in Western Europe has its own context. The policy that worked in Sweden may very much work in Britain, but it would not work in Italy. Why? Because Italy has a different context. It has a historical Muslim minority. You can't treat them all exactly the same autistically or the Protestant way, because that would actually create more problems than it would solve.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, Italy has a literal invasion, so they need a much stronger navy to just basically sink the boats, which is an issue that doesn't exist in Spain, because in Spain they come by land. And it's an issue that does exist in Greece, but it doesn't exist in, let's say, Romania. So it's a little bit more complicated. That's why I say there is no one policy. Every country has a different context, and they have to come up with a policy that works in their context. And to do that, you need politicians that are not just good speakers or oratory, have great oratorical skills. You need politicians that can actually understand how the bureaucracies of their own countries work, so they can come up with policy that fits the legal standards of their own country. And if it doesn't, then have politicians that are able to change constitutions or procedures or whatever needs to be changed. And this is where the non-left or the Islamocritic sector or the dissidents or whatever you want to call them, this is where this part of the thinking lacks quite a lot. I mean, every time I do lobbying or public policy, I'm usually the only one arguing for a very practical application of our thoughts. And then sometimes I actually find understanding for some of them, even among sectors of the left. And they honestly ask me, well, why can't you guys on the far right come up with more people like you? And I'm like, well, because most people on the far right likes to spend time on social media rather than learn procedure and policy and how to actually govern. Because, when the
Right.
left mocks the right when say, well, you guys can't govern, well, I'm sorry, but oftentimes they're right.
No, there's a
Oh,
difference between being in office and being in power. The
mm-hmm.
left may not be in office, but the left is in power.
Yes, and getting in power
Yeah,
requires, there's a certain playbook that you have to do. You have to
yeah,
have your own version.
consequences.
Yes,
People are afraid to take.
you have to have
Sorry?
your own version of the long march through institutions. What is the right-wing version of the common purpose? Do you even know what the common purpose is? The common purpose is a left-wing Freemasonry in Britain whose stated goal is to lead beyond authority, which in practice, and they say it, or they used to say it on their website, unless they've taken it down lately, because too many people on the far right started taking notes, and I guess they don't like that. But they used to say it basically that our point is to raise bureaucrats and policy wonks, and people who are not seen in public, who then
Ah,
forward our left-wing goals. They're very honest about it. France has such a school for right-wing activists to get into bureaucracies and institutions.
right.
Good for them. It's operated by Front National, or used to be. I don't know if it still is, whatever. Poland has such a school as well. It's called Collegium Intermarium, but that's pretty much it. Britain doesn't have one. Sweden doesn't have one. Germany, heck, Germany might be even illegal to have one. Most sectors of the right do not even try to raise their own activists, to raise their own
Yeah.
bureaucrats, so they
I
can
find that
become in
I find
power.
that on the right, they feel that if they've made a coherent, logical argument that is clearly correct, that that's all they need to do, and everyone will just be overawed by the incredible
Yeah,
genius and delivery.
that's
And
what I
then,
keep telling to right wingers. The world is not the Oxford Debate Society. Your mother is a fascist is just as much of a legitimate argument as a very coherent and very logical and genius argument. Because in the real world, who says something matters just as much, and fuck you is a very good argument. You don't like it? Tough shit. I didn't make the rules. I just got here. So, if right wingers are to win and become part of the power and be in power, they
you
have
know,
to learn the rules. They have to learn how the world works, the real world, not the online world, and then start playing by the exact same playbook that our opposition have been playing for so long.
mhm.
Because again, most of these tools are neutral. They're not inherently left wing. Most of them are very neutral. It's like a hammer. A hammer can be used to build a house or
Yeah,
to
but
kill
also I
people
think
with
that
it.
right-wing thinking and behavior is molded by the left. They've said, well,
At some point, yes.
If you want to be Christian, what you've got to do is you've got to be compassionate, have no concept of justice, and winning is wrong. So
Mhm.
there's how to be
This is
Christian that
again
they often lose.
a very specific Protestant way of thinking. The Orthodox world doesn't think like that. But yes, a lot of the segments of the Protestant world do think like that, to their detriment, of course,
Hmm.
because, well, I'm not a Christian, so I'm not going to make the theological argument, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. There is no theological basis for this weakness. Turning the
Yeah.
other cheek was meant for interhuman relationships between two men. It was not meant for civilizational structures. No, for
Yeah.
civilizational structures, Jesus brought the sword and cast people away from the temple, right? But again, this is something that right wingers, Christian or
Mhm.
not, will
No,
have to figure it out themselves and will have to, yeah, break the programming, I
yeah.
guess.
Someone
Although
mentioned
that
earlier that
sounds
1
weird.
million immigrants raises the GDP by 2% year on year. Now that
Maybe.
sounds supposedly 1 million immigrants raises the national GDP by 2% year on year.
Where?
Uh,
Where?
exactly, but no, the thing is, this doesn't take into account. These things sound great, but this doesn't take into account something like 70% of these immigrants coming over are illiterate in their own language. So
Oftentimes, yes.
you've got to start asking questions. How many violent, illiterate,
Mhm.
welfare-seeking, lazy immigrants do you need year on year? And then, of course, maybe your GDP increases in theory because that's inflation, because you've got to pump out more money to pay welfare for these people who cost you up to, what, £1 million for the time that they're there. But your individual income is lowered, your individual taxes increase, and actually your living standard declines.
Mhm.
Everything just goes into the toilet, as we're seeing
Now,
all across Europe. So
I
actually,
always ask where. So, no, a million immigrants increases the GDP by 2%. Where? In Croatia, in Britain, in Germany, in France, in Poland? Because it does matter. A million people has a different impact depending on the country. A million immigrants in Croatia would be a catastrophe. A million
right.
immigrants in the United States are barely noticeable. Right? A million immigrants into China are barely noticeable. So it does matter where
Mm.
and how and what kind of immigrants. Right?
I was reading
It
a
really does
fascinating
depend.
report a month or two ago. I was reading a fascinating report where two economists were working on consumption levels, housing and consumption, and the infrastructure levels in the UK. And they were saying that the official UK population is supposed to be something around 80 million, I believe, which includes known illegal immigrants. And they said, no, based on consumption, based on manufacture, consumption, exports, and other figures, and also usage of electricity, roads, and whatnot, what they were saying was the UK must have a population that's at least over 100 million. They said
Could be.
the population of the UK is underreported by at least 20 million. So, I mean,
Mm.
we're not getting accurate figures. No, no, this was an interesting report. These guys were, it was really, really fascinating.
Again, the total population of a country is routinely gotten wrong by the National Institute of Statistics. I was
Right,
giving you an hour ago the example of Germany, where they noticed that actually their total fertility rate is higher than they thought because their total population was smaller than they thought. No, and I can definitely believe that in Britain the population is being underreported. I just don't think it is underreported by a factor of 20%. That just sounds
right.
nah,
Yeah.
nah. It's too much. It's too much.
Uh, did it,
You can't hide. I mean, again, the United Kingdom is about the same size as Romania, geographically speaking. You can't hide
right,
20 million people, the entire population of Romania. You can't hide
right.
it. It would be noticeable. I can
No,
definitely,
fair enough.
I can definitely believe that there may be 2 million more people, or even 5 million more people. But 20,
Okay,
no, no, that just sounds.
okay. So Valinis has
And
asked, Poland took in 2 million Ukrainians. How's that affected the country? Many of them have actually moved on to other countries. There's that aspect.
or they went back.
Also, ethnically, they are very similar to the Poles. They speak very similar language. They learn the language very quickly. They fit in. So culturally, religiously, socially, they're very, very similar. The country's fairly large for a European country, so they distributed themselves. Many of them also have social ties, family ties that go back centuries. So it's not like taking someone from Tanzania and dropping him, in the middle of white neighborhood in Beverly Hills. It's nothing. It's
And
not
there's
like that.
also the thing that most people didn't know until the war started, and most people still don't know. There was already a 2.5 million immigrant Ukrainian community in Poland years before the war. I mean, I
Yes.
remember first time we met at your place and we filmed the first video. Um, just getting to your place, I got indications in Ukrainian on the street, right? And that was what 5 years prior to the Russia-Ukrainian war, right? So no, there
Mhm.
were already a lot of Ukrainians in Poland long before the war started, mostly for work,
Yeah.
and some of them settled, but most of them would go back after at the end of their contracts. It's pretty much it's a very similar situation with Romanians in Italy, right? Italian is basically, if I get drunk and don't eat properly, I'm fluent in Italian. It's a very similar language, very similar way of looking at life, very similar a lot of things. So as a result, it's not very difficult. And the other way around too, in the 30s, a lot of Italians immigrated into Romania. Nobody even knows that today, even though most of them never left. But they
Okay.
integrated so well that nobody notices. So the differences between the countries can sometimes be very small. And in
Well,
that case, an exchange of population doesn't do much harm. That's why I'm asking all the time, what kind of immigrants, into what country, from where,
where,
for how long? All of these precise questions get us closer to the answer on whether immigration is good or
and that's
not.
the kind of thing Thomas Sowell would ask.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
What hard evidence do you have, right? Compared to what? Right? The Thomas Sowell
Yes.
test. And
Right.
the right, just like the left, has fallen into this trap of not asking precise questions, of not being
Yeah.
precise in their language, right? The left says immigration is good, and the right says no, immigration is bad. Well, actually, you're both wrong. What kind of immigration we're talking about? What
Yeah. From
quantity?
whom?
From where? From whom? You're right.
Yeah.
More educated, less educated, more men, more women. It matters. All of these things matter, and they add up to a trade-off that we can deem is positive or negative. But first, we have to have the facts before we start judging on whether it's
Right.
positive or
Yeah.
negative. I mean,
Yeah, I want to say thank you to Prophet's Republic. Thank you very much for the donation. Much appreciated.
we had the immigration from Ukraine into Romania again before the war and during the war, and there were a few incidents here and there, but nothing significant. Why? Because, well, again, we've been living next to them for so long that yeah, sure, our languages are a little bit more difficult, more different. Ours is Latin, theirs is Slavic, but then again, during the Soviet Union, they had contact with some of our people, today called Moldova, who speak also Romanian. So it wasn't
Mhm.
entirely foreign to them, right? But it's not the same
Right.
situation when they come from, well, Tanzania or whatever, Nigeria or whatnot. So yeah.
Right. Question. So there's a question: will Putin's death trigger a new time? What is the consequence of Putin's death? Business as usual, you think?
Well, as far as we all know, there is no publicly appointed successor to Putin. Whether that has already been solved internally, that is to say, they do have a successor prepared and they just didn't tell anyone, then in that case, it's just mostly business as usual, at least for the first 6 months. And then the new leader will come up with new ideas, like it happened immediately after Stalin died, right? It took a little bit, a few months until the new leader came up with the de-Stalinization period, the secret speech in the Supreme Soviet and whatnot. Same thing now. A new leader will come up with new policy after 6 months or so, not immediately.
Mhm.
It won't be an immediate change. If they
Yeah.
don't have a successor, and what they say in public is true in private as well, then we'll see a little bit of chaos at the Kremlin until they figure out a new successor. I suspect it will be someone from the
Right.
Siloviki, the security apparatus as well. And I wouldn't be totally surprised if it's someone that we're not even thinking of. I
Right.
was asking people who lived in Russia for longer than I did and who've been following Russia for even longer than I did, and we started comparing notes. Who could be the next Putin? And after we made a list, reduced it down to like 5 or 6 people, then we were like, yes, but we can also come up with another 60 people that would actually fit, and it wouldn't be the first time it happened. I mean, Putin was not in cards at all to succeed to Boris Yeltsin, and then he
Okay.
did. So I
Okay.
suspect something like that will happen again.
Now, what is the consequence now of the MAGA movement now that the Emperor Trump has been convicted by a jury of his peers to 4 more years in the White House?
Uh, Economically or culturally or politically?
All of the above. I mean, what are your thoughts there? Because I
Okay,
think we're seeing a resurgence of culture. We're seeing people gaining more
okay.
cultural
Yeah,
courage.
the cultural influence will probably be the more lasting one, because at this point President Trump is no longer President Trump. Most people who voted for the GOP ticket, as Americans say it, they didn't vote for President Trump necessarily. A lot of the people voted for like fuck the Democrats, like fuck those people in particular, let them cry, make them cry. That was the motivation for a lot of
Mhm.
the Trump vote, right? And so at this point, President Trump is the embodiment of a legend, more than a particular politician. Because let's not forget,
Legends can be powerful. They
yes,
can
yes,
they can have
no,
lasting impact for
that's what I'm
centuries.
saying. The cultural impact of the MAGA will be much more lasting than people dare to realize at this point. I mean, for crying out loud, AOC removed her pronouns from her bio, right? I mean, you wouldn't have imagined that happening 3 months ago,
No.
right? Right. So, and suddenly, like clockwork, like someone ordered it from the above, more and more of these small left-wing organizations and corporations are like, well, maybe we've pushed the tranny thing a bit too much. Yeah, maybe we don't have to ask people their pronouns. Maybe take down some of those rainbow flags. Maybe, let's change a little thing. That doesn't happen at random. It's a result of strength, and the MAGAs do have a cultural strength attached to them. Whether they admit it or not, whether they intended it or not, doesn't matter. The optics are what they are, and they're so strong that even the left feels it, and they start to dial down a little bit, trying to regroup and whatever. But still, they have to admit certain things. I mean, Cenk Uygur sounds like a Republican at this point.
I
Of,
know.
right
Yeah, but
now, to be
he's
fair, Cenk has been a Republican in the past as well, so he knows how to play
But then,
that.
of course, he's Anna Kasparin. He's a co-host that's clearly been sliding to the right for some time now, and I think this affects him as well.
I
He
don't.
realizes,
I don't agree. I mean, Anna Kasparian admitted that men are men and women are women, and we now call that sliding to the right. I'm sorry, no.
on
Um,
some issues, I've seen her sort of tout through, say, Republican lines.
yeah,
So,
if you watch her
yeah, no, she's
interview,
coming back to reality. Look, I mean, you see, if you're sliding to the right, doesn't mean you could be so far to the left, you're coming back to the center. That's still
yes,
moving to the right.
yeah, I mean,
So,
she's coming from the leftist pole, so there's that. So look, the cultural legacy of MAGA will probably be much bigger than, much more influential than we dare to think and we dare to imagine at this point in time. Um, we never thought. I mean, did you fight the first meme war and the second meme war? I did. At that
probably
moment,
was involved.
I was hoping to get a Republican administration to at least get the Hillary bots to cry, and that was my best expectation. It turned out to be slightly better than that because it gave permission and courage to a lot of the silent people, the so-called shy Tory vote, as they call it in Britain, to start speaking out. But it was still too early. The first Trump administration came too early. The
Yeah.
pandemic project accelerated a lot of trends that were happening already prior to the pandemic project. But the pandemic project and the response by the left generally, both in Europe and the US, accelerated a lot of trends. More people started asking questions, and now we're having the balkanization of the internet and the balkanization of the media, which is great. I've been looking forward for this moment since 2014, so it was a long wait. These things will continue to happen, and with with people like Elon Musk or Bill Ackman, courage is contagious. It needed a spark, it needed a declick, something had to happen. And what happened was someone banned, what do you call it, the Babylon Bee. And then one thing led to another, and Elon Musk be like, okay, come on, what do you mean ban satire? And then it was like, you know what, maybe this thing is not for me. But then the liberals forced him to finish his purchase of Twitter. So he did.
Right.
And it's like, okay, now that I have it, well, might as well start playing with it.
And now the
And
guy's basically living in the White House next to the
yes,
president.
yes. So
Chaos
no,
for him.
well, yeah, or the just last 2 weeks ago, right? The Democrats were looking at how the election is going. Okay, what should we do now? Yeah, let's go kill a squirrel that has 7 million followers on Instagram. Yeah,
Incredible.
that will elect Democrats for sure,
That
right?
tipped people over the edge, man. Man,
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
egregious.
The county next, I mean, the county with the squirrel still remained Democrat, but with a D+1 rather than D+17. And the county next to it, which was in Pennsylvania, flipped red for the first time in 30 something years, right? Because, the people there locally were like, yeah, but we knew that squirrel. It was a fluff and it was cute. Why the hell do we kill it? Right?
Coming after the squirrels. I mean, they painted themselves as cruel and heartless.
Yes. So no, the cultural influence will be lasting. With political and economic, I'm a little bit more skeptical because while the second Trump administration contains a lot more people who actually know how to policy, and here I will give a shout out to my acquaintance, I don't dare call him a friend yet, Professor Jay Batahaya from Harvard, who was one of the few COVID skeptics who are actually correct on everything, and now he will be taking Fauci's place. He will be running the NIH instead of Fauci.
Fauci needs to, you know what? Something that I think that upsets me and everyone, because I come from South Africa where nobody goes to jail, no matter what they do.
Mm-hmm.
People need to be punished. People need
Mm-hmm.
to go to jail. It is not
Yes,
revenge. It is
justice.
justice. People need to go to jail, and this has to happen in the US. And it doesn't seem to be a popular decision, but someone's got to say, look, man, if you keep letting people get away with it, they will just keep doing it.
Of
At
course.
some point.
Yeah. So, the second Trump administration definitely does have more people who know how to policy. Even RFK, which again is not even a conservative, RFK is a pro-abortion Democrat. Let's not forget that, right? The current Trump coalition contains a lot of left-wing people, just old school left-wing people,
Right.
right? But, as much as I disagree with RFK on a lot of issues, he's the kind of crazy that is absolutely necessary because public health is illegitimate and it's been exercising illegitimate authority for so long that you need a crazy there that starts from this premise. The premise of RFK is that everything a doctor says is a lie ipso facto. And that's exactly what's needed because, the medical profession has become so illegitimate that a decade of probatio diabolica type of regimen would do it a lot of good. And would do
just
a
the
lot of
fact
good.
that they have immunity, that these
Yes.
pharmaceutical manufacturers have
Yeah,
immunity.
why should you have immunity? Let's explore that. Let's see how that works out, right? So, again, I'm not a big fan of RFK generally, but at this particular juncture, he's probably a good pick. And he'll probably enact good policy for the wrong reasons, and I'll take that. Because ultimately, I'm a policy wonk. I'm an activist, a lobbyist, the kind of person that gets policy done. And I don't care if I have to work with people I don't like. I mean, during the pandemic project, I worked with very terrible people, but we got policy right. I mean, we got permanent jurisprudence in Romania that protects the right to protest and assembly in an absolute sense. So, even if airborne Ebola shows up, the government can no longer do lockdowns, like at all, right? So, that was my aim during the pandemic project. Let's expand our liberties now that the government has been stupid enough to tempt me on that. But even though the second Trump administration has better people in terms of policy, I don't think they'll be able to enact the sweeping reform that they're hoping for. I hope they'll prove me wrong, but
I think
knowing
they'll
my
have 12 years. I think they'll have the next 12 years sewn up. I
if they
think they're going
manage to have 12 years with President Vance after President Trump, then yes, in 12 years that
to.
is
I
absolutely
think this is the
doable.
plan. They need to shut down the Democrat fraud machine and immigration election machine, and I think they have a chance.
Yeah, if they have 12 years, but if they only have 4, they'll be able to, if they try hard enough, they'll be able to pass the kind of reform that would have been unimaginable 3 months ago. They'll be able to do that. But doing the full sweeping reform as they expect, as the base wants, that will take a little bit longer.
Well, look, there's
Bureaucracies
going to
have
be
their own
opposition. Look
inertia.
at Maloney. She's trying to get these boats blocked, but the courts are
Yes,
legislating from the bench and they're stopping her. At some
yes,
point, she's going to have to do an end run around the courts, or she's just going to have to go against them. Period. I don't
yes.
know how she's going to solve that. I mean, that's because the courts are leftist and
I,
they've
I
been
know how she will. Maybe, I mean, I don't know. I was advised not to talk about it, but I will because I'm me. Um, The plan is basically you'll have to subvert the constitutional system of Italy. And it sounds awful when you put it in these terms, but we
they're
have
already
to.
subverting it. So what choice does she
No, no, no,
have?
no, 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 no. You have to understand in Italy, the constitution is like the terms of service. It can be changed on a whim, it doesn't even require a referendum. And
Okay.
what she's trying to do now is to remove that decision from the political class and move it back to partly but to the public via referenda, like it's in France or in Romania, in such a way that then you should push through a referendum on immigration, which would pass definitely. And then she can basically say both to the courts and to the parliament, look, fuck you. I have 31
Okay.
million votes that says I have to do this. Screw you all. But in order to do that, you need a constitutional reform, and it's very difficult to do that as long as you have that geezer who I always forget the name of the president of Italy, a geezer who is like 80 something and has been just been reelected for another 7-year term. And the president of Italy, generally speaking, people say that, well, the president of Italy doesn't matter, doesn't have much power. Actually, when it comes to constitutional reform and appointing the chiefs of the courts, that power resides with the president, not with the prime minister. So she would have to work around those people. It is doable, but it requires a lot of time.
You know,
Whether the
doesn't this
voters,
tell us though that we are in a fight that we have to win? This is not about the will of the people. Let's work together. And next time if we win the election, we'll implement our policies. This is a win or lose fight for these people, and we have to accept it on those terms. And I don't think everyone has come to that conclusion. I think everyone's thinking, well, it's all fair play and kumbaya. This is about, look, they have to lose. There is no option. These are enemies. They must lose. I think the West has forgotten the concept of having enemies.
yes, yes, there is this problem, and I always, in fact, since the pandemic project, I've actually had more heated arguments with right wingers than with the leftists. Because the leftists, when they see my radical rhetoric and especially my radical policy that I lobby in parliaments and whatnot, they recognize the playbook and they play by the playbook, which is, they try to demonize my policy and I try to demonize them as people and whatnot. And, sometimes I win, sometimes I lose, but they treat me with respect. But right wingers are like, oh, but this is immoral. What do you mean go by after his family? And well, I'm sorry, this is the game. They are the enemy. You don't treat the enemy with kitty gloves. These are people who want you dead because you exist. You either defend yourself or you don't, but you don't
It's
get
amazing
to...
that you understand. Why do you understand it? I come from the third world, so I have the third world mind, which is one half of me sees life from the third world and the other half sees it from the first world. But how did you develop this view? Because there's a naivete there. There's a lack of a grasp of reality. And what makes you different here?
Growing up in communism and post-communism.
Actually, that's a fair point there.
The old school commies were pretty brazen and blatant about things. They didn't have this convoluted language that the current Western left has. They were a bit more honest about things. Yeah, no, we're going to treat this person better because he's the friend of the party, and we're going to treat this person worse because they're a counter-revolutionary or a bourgeois
Right.
scum or a Western degenerate or whatever the language was at the time, because they had multiple labels for basically non-friend, right? Enemies. I just observed them, and then I started reading their literature. And again, the left has the most extensive literature on how to exercise political power. What right-wingers don't understand is that you have to read those because most of what they talk about in terms of tools on how to exercise political power are very neutral. They don't have to be used for leftist goals. They can be used for non-leftist goals as well. How many right-wingers have read Herbert Marcuse? How many right-wingers know how to exercise repressive tolerance
Do you
from the
know who they
right?
even are?
Yeah, or even know who these people are. Yes. So that's basically what I do when I school
What's the Rules for Radicals
activists.
guy? What's his name? Rules for
Saul
Radicals.
Alinsky. Saul Alinsky.
Alinsky. Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
his playbook is the standard sort of playbook you see everywhere.
For community
And
organizing, yes, but for exercising state power, you need Herbert Marcuse, and you need
okay,
Horkheimer, and you need quite a few other these left-wing thinkers. And again, they themselves wrote that those tools are neutral. They were approaching it, they learned it from the bourgeois school, and they say, well, look, we can use these to forward left-wing
yeah,
goals.
it's crazy the concept that if we win, we're violating the rule of equality, therefore we're wrong, so we can't win. It's crazy to me when I see this and hear this.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, I was discussing with a bunch of students these days, thinking of taking over a certain bureaucracy, and then some people from my network, and then we're already thinking the next step. Okay, who do we employ in that bureaucracy from our people to give patronage to our people and create an infrastructure that is paid for by other people's money for our people, so we can grow our structures.
Yeah.
And they were like, one of the students was a bit more naive, again, students like 19-year-olds. Yes, but wouldn't that be state interventionism? And I'm like, I don't care. We'll have that discussion when the enemy has been subdued. Until then, no, we're going to use all of the tools available
First you win.
to increase our strength and explicitly decrease the enemy's strength. I mean, there is no such thing as rules in warfare.
Exactly. You crush your enemies, you hear their cries of anguish, and you listen to the lamentation of their women, and then you make your decisions.
Yes.
So Claxon says true, right-wingers don't have a friend-enemy distinction. There's something more important to that. A culture or a people or a group that have lost the friend-enemy distinction have been successfully propagandized and demoralized by their ideological enemies. It is one of the specific goals of ideological subversion, of a takeover of a nation without using bullets, but using propaganda.
Mhm.
So if you don't have that distinction, if you cannot recognize friends and enemies, or at least you cannot recognize enemies, you have been ideologically subverted. They
Yes.
have taken over that ideological mind space and you've lost.
Mhm.
So you have to have a friend enemy distinction.
Yes, and this will continue for many, many more years. And what I'm afraid, well, afraid is a too strong of a word. Uh, what I'm concerned about is that at some point we may actually end up going into the wrong direction, and that is to say, to be too rigid. You have to have some flexibility. The founding fathers of the US, they didn't even envision political parties. They envisioned ad hoc coalitions based on issues, right? So, or as Dugin would call it, a coalition depending on the current political project, right? Pretty much the same type of philosophy. I function on the same type of philosophy. I just said earlier that during the pandemic project, I worked with some terrible people who otherwise I wouldn't consider them friends, but when we have mutual interest, we work with those. And then when the political project is over, everyone goes on their merry ways. Now, with some of those people, I'm in opposition now in other political projects. And that's fine. Because when you're in such a precarious position as the right is in most countries today, you can't afford. You go to war with the army that you can afford. You don't go to war with the army that you dream of, right? I would love to have an army of 1 million libertarians who also understand markets, but also understand societal standard and also understand comparative religion and policy. That would be awesome,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't have that army. So because I don't have that army, well, we're going to have to make do with whatever is available. So the friend enemy distinctions is necessary, but we'll have to be very careful with how rigid we make it. But that's a problem for a decade from now.
Look, on the right, on the political right, like in the US, you have more of a moderate strand in that people like that want to come back to the center. They want to be reasonable. Whereas on the left, they just keep going left.
Yes,
Unless they won't stop unless stopped. So there is that filter, that inhibition on the one side of the political aisle, which is
of
kind of
course,
built into
of
the
course.
moral structure.
Yes, because the left is fundamentally an extension of the revolutionary mentality. And the revolutionary mentality doesn't have a stoppage to it. Right? There is no brakes to the revolutionary
Mm.
train. That's
I
why
mean,
the meme
one way
with
to
the
phrase that,
circular firing squad and all of those
yeah,
memes, they're all reliant on the same philosophical point, which is that the revolutionary mentality just never stops. Whereas the
yeah.
conservative mentality, or the constrained mentality, as Thomas Sowell would put it in the Conflict of Visions, is more like, okay, let's first ask. So, for instance, practical politics. There is a fence in the middle of a field.
Actually, that's actually in a real sense, that's actually part also of a religious mindset, shall we say, a Catholic religious mindset, where you don't become the arbiter of right and wrong. You have an external authority outside of
Mm,
yourself that you
mm,
turn
mm,
to check, like a mother or a father figure. I mean,
mm,
in a metaphorical sense, that you will ask and see, is this, what would my mother think? What would Jesus think? What would the church think? What would my priest think?
mm,
There's that constraining, and in fact, that is one of the telling signs. There's a very good book on psychopathy that I read by a particular scholar who worked on the topic, and he said that one thing that sets psychopaths apart is that they are the arbiter of what is right and wrong for them,
mm,
whereas
mm.
people who are
It's a
not
bit more
psychopaths,
complicated than that.
yeah, I know we don't have like 5 hours to go through that, but he stated that for him, a simple rule of thumb is psychopaths will decide for them what is right and wrong in a given moment. They're the arbiter, whereas normal people will ask, what would my brother think of me? What would my father think of me? They
Now,
would stop and have that external authority. Yeah.
this kind of mentality is good enough for individuals. The problem is when it seeps into public policy. Like, for instance,
Mm.
I will decide what's right in my house, and I don't give a shit whatever anyone else
That's
thinks.
tribal mentality. That's what happens in South Africa with the blacks. That's tribal
Yeah, no,
mentality.
yeah. In my house, I decide what's right and what's wrong, and if you don't like it, tough shit. Don't be in my house. But when it comes to public policy, you can no longer use this kind of mentality because you inevitably do more harm than good, no matter how
Mhm.
pure your intentions are. So I was giving the example in practical politics. We're walking down a field and we find a fence that is kind of inconvenient for us because the fence runs for like 5 kilometers and we have to move beyond that fence, but we can't jump over it. So we have to work around for 5 kilometers around the fence. Now, the progressive instinct is let's just make a hole into the fence and just pass through it because it's inconvenient for our political project. Whereas the conservative instinct is okay, maybe that's good policy, but first, let's find out why is this fence here? Who erected it? And for how long has it been here? What was its initial purpose? Does it still serve a purpose today? And after we ask these questions and find out the answer, if the answers are that, well, it's no longer needed, it's been erected 500 years ago and nobody cares about it anymore, then okay, fine, we'll poke a hole into it and pass through it. But what if any of these questions tell us that actually that fence defends against something far more dangerous, and as a result, we're probably better off leaving the fence there and walking the 5 kilometers around it. Right? That's the difference between the revolutionary mentality and the constrained mentality. The constrained mentality asks reality around first before acting. Or there's, as the metaphor goes, a good tailor measures 50 times before cutting once.
So that would
Right?
also measure, that would also tell us you've got people who are considerate rather than people who are narcissistic or arrogant.
Yeah, well, arrogance tends to go hand in hand with the revolutionary mentality, yes.
That is all very interesting. I mean, you've told me that yeah, you don't do streams very often, and
No.
you you'd have an opportunity in perhaps 6 months, which is unfortunate because I mean you've got some very interesting insights, not necessarily comfortable, but very valuable insights and perspectives on some of these things, and also you view that fact that most of the world doesn't think like the Western world does, even though the Western world is what is predominant on social media, and that tends to be very skewed to the left. Although hopefully X will start to fix that and become a proper
Yeah, it's one
marketplace
of
for
the
ideas.
many reasons why I nowadays have a neo-Luddite outlook, not by intention, but by necessity. I basically force people, I take away their smartphones, and
All
I'm
right.
like, no, 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 let's live for a few days at least without a smartphone. And I never had a smartphone, by the way, never. I still don't. And
Mhm.
that's something that just happened. It wasn't something that I chose ideologically or whatever. But the more time goes on and I still stay without a smartphone, the more I get to observe people around me how they negatively transform into something else because of those goddamn things. And now it's more like a point of pride that I don't have a smartphone,
Right.
because not having a smartphone means I'm not subjected to algorithmic bullshit and algorithmic brainwashing day in
Right.
and day out. Right?
Yeah.
Um,
You know,
Go
no,
ahead.
finish your thought. No, you're
Yeah. So,
making me.
so when you're too embedded into social media, you tend to think, and it's again a natural thing. I'm not slighting people. People are fundamentally flawed. So it's a natural thing to start thinking that what you see on Facebook or X or whatever is the world. Now, as someone who's been through 120 something countries, I can tell you that it's not the world. And most of what you see on social media applies not even to the West as a whole, but more like to specific subsets of the West. Like even the United States. I mean, the United States is probably one of the most misunderstood countries on earth, because 90% of what you read about or watch about the United States on social media is specifically California and certain neighborhoods of Los Angeles, certain neighborhoods of New York, certain portions of Portlandia, and that's pretty much it. How many shows or cultural content you've seen happening in rural Texas? Right? Texas is a huge place, right? It's bigger than
Ben.
Germany, but it doesn't have the cultural influence, and that is also
Oh,
the problem that comes from right wingers being pussies. Right wingers left the cities and moved to suburbs because they want to be left alone. Okay, fine. But if first of all, the left won't leave you alone, that's for sure. But even when they do, well, you basically cede the entire ground, the entire source of cultural legitimacy and cultural influence to the enemy. The left
oh.
plays culture by itself. How many
Well,
Republicans are in Hollywood? How many Republicans are in
not many.
yeah, there you go. Because
Also,
right
you
wingers left
mentioned
the cities. How many Republican mayors even try? I mean, in Chicago, there was the best opportunity after that black woman who was absolutely atrocious as mayor. There
mhm,
was the opportunity for a Republican to win the elections. Republicans didn't even field the candidate. I'm sorry, but if you don't play, you're not going to win.
win. Well, look, you mentioned that on the left you've got a revolutionary mindset, a Marxist, socialist, communist mindset, right? Which is by definition, Marx believes in his jihad, his communist jihad, right?
Mm,
That they have to
in a
seize
way,
power
yes.
through violence. But when you look at it from a criminal point of view, because they know that they're doing things that are criminal, hence the subversion and so on, violence has one essential characteristic: it escalates. And people have to realize it will always escalate. It'll keep
Mhm.
going further and further until you stop it. There is no
Yes.
reasoning with it. It needs to be stopped. Therefore, you must be active.
The reason I'm afraid of revolutionary mentality, especially when I see it on the right, there are some people who think of themselves as right wingers, but they also suffer from revolutionary mentality. And to those people, I always say, look, you can start a violent revolution, but you're no longer in control on what happens with it. The mob will develop a mind of its own, and you cannot manage it. I've seen
Yep.
this happening before. I mean, heck, it happened in my country. It started from something relatively benign and developed and devolved into something really harsh. Luckily, we're very lucky that we got stopped just after the commie was killed, which was great. And I think one of the big mistakes of that revolution was that we only killed 2 people. We should have killed about 5,000, but that's a separate story for another day. But that was the lucky one. In Albania, for instance, they started their anti-communist revolution the same way, but they weren't so lucky. So the revolution actually lasted for another 6 years, and it
Well,
was a full-blown civil war, and it took forever to actually get back to peace.
yeah.
So
But this should tell.
while there is a place for violence, we have to be very careful when we think about it, and we have to be very careful not to trigger it unnecessarily, because once that happens, nobody is good
Yeah,
enough to
you
manage it.
need proper rules of engagement if you're going to. When violence is the answer, it is the only answer, but you need decent rules of engagement,
Mhm.
and you need a process for knowing when you are going to
And
escalate
even
that
there,
level.
there's a. If you want, I can give you another story. I spoke with the Venezuelan opposition in Bogota, in Colombia. Colombia has a lot of Venezuelan refugees, and including some political figures, whatever. And they had a protest, manifestation, whatever, concert, something in between those in Bogota. I'm going to make a video about it because I have the footage for it. And I started talking with them, and since they heard that I'm from Romania, they were more inclined to listen to me because I'm from the country that actually shot its dictator. And I started telling them that, look, that's exactly what you have to do. You have to pick up weapons and you have to shoot Maduro. You can vote your way into socialism, but you have to shoot your way out.
Yes, yes.
And yes, and their answer was like, "Oh, but we can't do that because that would be violence." Well, fine, then do another flash mob. See if Maduro cares.
Have polite conversation. See if that
Yeah, have
works.
a polite conversation with the Maduro regime. Yeah, that's going to work out just fine. And it was the same thing. I was having the exact same conversation with a guy who was a child during the Operation Orion, during the fight with the cartels in Escobar's neighborhood. That guy had very little education, of course. And, for him, it was self-evident. Yes, of course, the Venezuelans have to pick up weapons and solve the problem. But for the highly educated non-communist elite of Venezuela, it wasn't self-evident. They were like, yeah, but
Mm.
maybe we can have Western pressure. And I'm like, I don't care. You can convince Trump to say that you are right and Maduro is wrong. You still have to fight your war. Nobody else can do it. So there are some situations where violence is the solution, but in those situations you still need rules of engagement. But unfortunately, at least in the case of Venezuelan opposition, they're not even to the point where understanding that weapons are good. So
Right.
it's a clusterfuck. That's what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
but then again, people think they're clean and simple moral solutions when things are not necessarily as simple as that.
When
Last,
that is possible, great, but sometimes it's not.
yeah. Now, last point. We don't live in a Disney world, although these days Disney is pretty morally messed up.
Disney
Um,
doesn't live in the Disney world anymore, but that's a separate story.
that's fair enough. That's fair enough. Disney, yeah, Disney should go bankrupt and get bought and get fixed. Um, we we don't know that we're approaching 2.5 hours. This conversation has gone. Time has flown by, and
We've had 7-hour conversations before, so
yeah, no, I just wasn't planning on a 7 hour conversation, and no, not tonight, not definitely. But I think we've had a very engaged audience. Something that we don't have the time maybe to discuss, and something, if you are free in 6 months' time, something as you said you may be, would be great to have you back and talk about apartheid, the apartheid regime, the apartheid history. That's something I have some knowledge about, and that's something that is highly historically and morally contentious. A lot of it is lies and propaganda spread by the ANC, successfully, highly successful propaganda campaign. And that's something worth talking about, even though in South Africa, that would probably get me in jail if I had to have that conversation. But there are things that I think that were objectively better about the apartheid government in terms of infrastructure, economy, safety, healthcare, education.
definitely public order. Yeah.
certain issues, and many of these supposed crimes of the apartheid regime are exaggerated. There is that. And also, for instance, South Africa had something like under 330 political prisoners, whereas the UK had 3,500. But South Africa was the mean, nasty, bad guy. And Britain, it's okay as long because we're British, and it's okay. We can jail as many as we like. Cuba had 600,000 people in prison, but you can't accuse the communists because that would be racist. So you had a lot of hypocrisy. You had the South African blacks were the second wealthiest blacks on the planet after the Americans.
Mhm.
South African blacks had more cars than all of Africa combined, which means the
Sounds about
wealth.
right.
Yeah, South African blacks had access to healthcare. You could do a heart transplant operation for literally $2 or $3, subsidized by the government, which would cost you and bankrupt you in the US if you were a black person in the US. And there were numerous other things. Those are things I'd love to discuss. It's a very delicate topic. I don't know if it's worth being overly delicate about it. It's time that these things just get said bluntly, and I think that it should be discussed because they
If
are
we look at
objective.
if we look at the 100-year time window, we're still too early, right? Around 2018, we started being honest about World War One because
All
it
right.
was 100 years after, and because when it comes to these delicate events in history, whether it's the Armenian genocide, World War
Mhm.
One, the Holocaust, the apartheid, whatever, it's usually about 100 years you have to wait, maybe 90, maybe 110, but usually around 100, because you have to have all of the people involved die, all of their children die, and their grandchildren to already be adults. So it's about 100 years, because that's the time when we no longer have high emotions about it, right?
Mhm.
Today we can make jokes about
Did you
how
do a video on this? Because I believe
Yes,
I watched it.
yes,
Yes, yes,
yes,
I
I
watched
did.
the video.
Yeah, so
Brilliant.
no, today we can make jokes about how Napoleon was kind of short and maybe had a small dick and had has narcissistic personality disorder. No,
Napoleon
but
never
no,
existed. I mean, these
yeah, well,
Napoleon mythicists. I'm
then
very
there's that.
disappointed
Yes,
that people believe that story.
yeah. In any event, we can make any joke we want. We can even say
Yeah,
Napoleon didn't exist. No one cares. There is no emotional investment to it. Why? Because it was a long time ago. Who the hell cares who's offended, right? But
right.
we still cannot do that about the Holocaust, and definitely not about apartheid, because there's still people alive who have an emotional investment, whether against or for it. But
Hmm.
once 100 years pass, then we can start having a more honest conversation about it. And sometimes that can lead to very unfortunate conclusions, or maybe not. But until 100 years have
Yeah.
passed, any
Well,
conversation will be
well,
pretty much rife with
fortunately,
emotion.
look, you are aware that Jesus was a Palestinian, and therefore his neighbors were Palestinian, his people were Palestinian, and therefore Jesus was killed by Palestinians. You need to ask your nearest Palestinian why the Palestinians murdered Jesus. Please ask. I'd like to know.
Uh,
Okay, because the Jews only arrived in Israel in 1948. Fact. True story. So we need to ask why the
I guess
Palestinians murdered
the
Jesus.
second I from INRI, which is on every cross, at least in the Orthodox world, the second I thought it stood for Judea, but I think I was wrong about that, right?
You are, because
All
Mary
right.
was Moses was a Muslim, Jesus was a Muslim, and he was a Palestinian. Everyone knows this, and so we need to find out why the Palestinians murdered Jesus. I think it's a fair question. It's been more than 100 years now. We need some answers.
Yeah. After 2,000 years, maybe we can get some answers. Yeah, I mean,
I think
I try to stay away from this kind of level of crazy because ultimately, I think this is one of those topics that is meant to waste time. The more time I waste on crazy like that, the less time I waste on lobbying and changing policies and making things better in my country. So I've become pretty intolerant with a lot of these things. I'm just
yeah,
yeah,
but
no,
those
do
things
I?
are real. I mean, people are pushing that,
Yeah, I know, I know,
and the
I know.
logical absurdities that these things create. But the thing is, you can turn these around and use them against these people
Oh, of
because they're
course.
stupid. And I think people should. I think people should use sarcasm. People should use
Ridicule is the man's most
ridicule.
potent weapon, said Solalinsky, and he was right.
And we need to. True story. People use these Muslims' crazy stories against them. They've painted themselves into corners. Be creative.
Mhm.
Simply do to them before they do unto you. And
Mhm.
I mean, in the future, I'd like to have, I'm already planning to do some talks on apartheid. I think it's time to look at economic numbers, look at facts, look at figures, look at, houses built, classrooms built, not from an emotional point of view, but just let's look at the economics, how much money the white government was spending to uplift black people.
And as
Let's
I
look at the,
said, we're too early for that. It's just been too early. And
but it will annoy the right people.
yeah, for sure, for sure.
I think that's also
Uh,
very important. It will annoy the right people. And, I think sometimes that is very, as someone very wise once said, and excuse my French here, but someone said, part of the fun in life is pissing off bitches.
oh yeah, for sure, for sure.
And,
Yeah, maybe we can do it with a comparison with the apartheid in Israel. I mean, it could be a very funny video.
people misuse the word apartheid. So if you are free in 6 months, I think that's when you said,
I mean,
let me know.
if we do a comparison, apartheid South Africa versus Israel, then we get to piss off two bubbles, which is even better. I mean, I'm just saying.
You're
But
right. So
whatever,
let's talk
your
about
show,
that.
your rules. We'll try.
So let's talk about that as to when we can do this. I think because I need to prep because look, I mean, this is going to cause a lot of frustration. I've spoken a few things on my channel and it caused a lot of upset. But I think it's a conversation we need to have. I mean, the truth is the truth. The facts are the facts. If we can argue about the truth, but let's just present the facts. Let's start there. And I think, yeah. So, any final words? And I'll call it a night for now, and we can chat again. But this has been fascinating. I mean, incredible. Your knowledge, your insights, your perspectives. I mean, really educational, really broad and deep as well. Any final thoughts from you?
Well, I don't know. Stay away from revolutionary mentality. I mean, I'm serious. If you stay away from revolutionary mentality and you stay away from topics meant to waste your time, then you'll suddenly find yourself having more time available to be an effective activist. Writing something on Facebook doesn't count as doing something. Nagging your local councillor, nagging your local police officer, nagging your authority, making a FOIA request, exposing something, that counts as doing something. Writing something nice on Facebook doesn't count. Nobody
Going
cares.
to your school board meeting, harassing your school council.
Yes,
Why are you
yes,
teaching gay things to my kids?
yes, yes, yes. All of those things count as doing something. And look at the Muslims. I mean, do they have gay shit in their school in Birmingham? No, because they showed up and said, "Look, we're gonna burn you all alive. You can go through with this." And there you go. They don't have it. So now use their precedent. Now you have an exemption within the British law for Birmingham. Use that to get that into other communities as well. And by the way, a lot of Muslims will be very happy to help you with that. Make a per issue alliance, ad hoc alliance, depending on the political project. It's really that simple.
Excellent point. Yeah, excellent point. Very excellent point. Well, thank you. I mean, there's so many things we could have discussed, but I think it's a good place to end here, especially as I have school tomorrow.
Okay.
I've got to get up, brush my teeth, brush my hair, and put on my uniform and head off to school tomorrow.
All right.
So unlike you, unfortunately, who gets to live a life of freedom. So,
For now,
by the way,
anyway.
last question: what made you call your channel the Freedom Alternative? What was the logic, the theory?
There was
idea behind
an inflation of political parties in 2014 and early 2015 called the Socialist Alternative. And I'm like, yet another socialist alternative. Nobody tries to think about the alternative in the direction of freedom. So, okay, if you want something done, you do it yourself. And that's how the name Freedom Alternative.
Alternative für Deutschland. I mean, people are trying to put them in jail. They're trying to put her in jail. It's crazy.
Yeah, well, again, I've met the elite of AfD. There is a conference that I attended to. It's in Germany. It's on my channel, published in 2019. Most of their elite are also pretty weak. I mean, they don't regard the regime as their enemy. They don't regard their opposition as their enemy. And they're not prepared. And they've gotten better in the last 5 years, but still, no. That's why I'm not particularly optimistic. And not to mention they have so many Duginists in their party. So, there's plenty of people who could help them that stay away from helping them because they have too many. They cough in Cyrillic too much.
Wow, they need to negotiate from a position of strength, and that means you crush your enemy first, and then and you realize you can't trust them. So no, that's excellent advice, and thank you for the practical advice. And I really enjoyed it. So I'll call it a night here, and we'll talk more about doing an apartheid stream. But guys, thank you all very much for the engagement, for the questions. I hope it was all educational for all of you. It certainly was for me. And Lucian, man, it's been glorious. It's been fantastic. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. We'll try again.
Good night, everyone.